All right, everybody, welcome to part two of Being in the World. This is part of the series. This is part 6 in the series called The Fundamental Problems and Core Concepts at Theory Underground. I was thinking about how last time for part 5, I did not say whether this is a fundamental problem or a core concept. And in a sort of sense, Heideggerians, like that meme where Batman is slapping Robin, they would be slapping me for saying that being in the world is a concept, because Heidegger, of course, doesn't want to call it a concept. He wants to think of it as something else. Anytime that we're talking about one of these existentialia or an existential category of being of our being in the world, or of Dasein, they're going to say that's not a concept. Like Heidegger is trying to go beyond concepts and think in a way that doesn't frame stuff that way. And that's fine. And I think that it's important to say that, which is why I just did. So, yes, I slapped myself there. But with that said, speaking loosely, being in the world is both concept and fundamental problem. Right. And so I think it's on page 250 of Being in Time, I talked about when being in the world gets shattered, what you're left with is a world of individualized subjects who relate to the world as objects and tools. And of course, if you want to think about capitalism, we relate to other people as objects and tools, not at the level of like you go into the store and you're like, that cashier is just a tool. And if they obstruct my ability to get out of here quickly, I'm annoyed by them. Though there is that is obviously a factor. That is a part of it. Hey, Daisy, I've got a puppy here and she needs a bone or something. You need a bone or something, don't you? No, it's deeper though than that sort of whether you consciously treat someone else as a tool or not, because anytime that you acquire anything from the market, there's a whole world of people out there doing stuff to make that possible. And of course, it has nothing to do with your attitude. It has nothing to do with your conscious awareness of them. In fact, it works better when they are bracketed out altogether, right? And so this gets us to one of the essential existentials of being in the world. Heidegger spends all of chapter 4 in Being in Time, division 1, talking about it, and it is being with. I'm going to do something I haven't done in this series so far and bring in another person. And at the same time, this will sort of commemorate the basis for the launch of a whole new thing. So I'm kind of getting two birds with one stone here. And I thought, what better time and place to do it than in the discussion of being with. And so who am I being with today? In this sort of vulgar sense, Bauer. Welcome to Theory Underground. How you doing, man?
Pleasure being with you, Dr. Uncle Dave. First time, long time. Yeah, it's great to be here. Uh, Thanks for having me. And th that's about it. Friends call me
Yeah,
Big Daddy.
yeah, yeah. For those who don't know, which is most people, we met back a long time ago in the university, and have been involved with various kinds of IRL organizing. And we'll say more about that later. But for right now, I'll want to move forward with being in the world. And want to say, before we started this recording, we listened to mostly Rebecca and Luke having a conversation after Being in the World Part 1. Remember, for anyone who just watched that, I do recommend going back and watching that if you're watching this now. I said, hey, sorry, I don't have time to field questions or whatever, but I got to bounce. I will be listening. I do care, whatever, so I did that this morning here with Bauer. We just listened, and it was a really great, short conversation, about 20 minutes long. And in it, one of the major focuses was the family. In particular, Luke was saying he doesn't know what to do with it, and that it's kind of just like it's just like this big idea that he wants to think about. He wants to problematize it. Rebecca did a little steel manning of it. They talked a little bit about the relation between family and society, how a society can always come from families, but families could not just spawn from society. So it's kind of a chicken and egg thing. Though, of course, what kinds of resources a family has at its disposal are going to be defined by that society. The horizon of possibility for that family is defined by the society. So though we could think of some hypothetical world where you have some Swiss Family Robinson on an island somewhere and they get to build society just from the family, that's great. You know, Swiss Family Robinson is like Robinson Crusoe, but it's a family, right? It's the same kind of story idea. It's a lot more fun because there's more people involved. And I think they end up fighting pirates. You know, there's a movie version of it that I saw as a kid. But though we can imagine that in the same way, you know, as with Robinson Crusoe, we can imagine it, they're nonetheless products of a society. So they bring the society that they're from there to that island. So even though you're saying, well, they don't have any resources from their society, in a deeper sense, they obviously have the resources of their society. They have language. They have ideas of the various kinds of technologies that they themselves might be able to create from the natural resources that they are surrounded by. Okay. Bauer, they touched on a few other things, but also you had a few bullet points that you were talking about. And I think that those are all a really great place to sort of springboard into this part two. So why don't you take it away, Doctor?
Yeah, did you want to jump into the explorations of like the concept of love or something more focused on the family or that idea that like you bring everything you are with you wherever you go?
I'll bring it back to the family, but I mainly it's those bullet points you have, you know, kind of just touching on the main ones, being with, Throwness, and bracketing. If you got
Mm,
some opening remarks to make about those, and then I'll say a few things about that. Then I'll read a quote here. Maybe I'll have you read the quote, and then I'll unpack it for a little bit, and it'll help people, I think, get a sense for what we're getting at with the concept of, or the existential of, being with.
mm. Yeah, I part of wrestling with our facticity, or I like the term thrownness, even though there's a mild differentiation, but just how they're used differently. I really like the active component of how we're thrown into a world previously in existence, and the world before us is going on without our control. We find ourselves in a situation. I like to think of it in kind of drug comatose terms, where we like come to in a state that is existing around us. Everything is set up that way. Well, set up makes it seem like it's intention, but you know, existentially, phenomenologically, whatever, it is that way. And it like something we can do with thinking about thrownness is go beyond ourselves too and our relation with other people. So related to this idea that a family is still subject in its extent to be powerful, to have influence, to have a good or positive effect, to achieve certain outcomes based on the society that it is subject to. And in the same way, when I'm thinking about thrownness, it sounds a bit cheesy, maybe cliche, but I love shit like this because it's so wholesome. Is why is it that we don't often take into account the kind of thrownness, the facticity of the state of other people that they're in? You know, when I think of things like building connection, even related to family, this very being with idea that there is a kind of togetherness, a kind of connectedness, more loosely, kind of vulgarly speaking, like it's really easy. Well, it's I would actually take that back. It's hard enough to see our own state of thrownness that we're in. That's what requires this kind of bracketing to even get to that point to begin with. Uh,
Right.
but that's not the end, you know. The kind of way I view this as being operationalized in a world where, of course, there's the loneliness crisis and the death of community everywhere. Forget the death of God. The community is more precious to me right now.
Mm,
We can't even have God without that. I see that, like, why don't we take other people's facticity into account, where they are, etc.
mm,
Uh, there can only be so much precise overlap in a world of beings in the world being in the world. You know, we ought to get better at approaching others with this. I love the religious terminology of like grace given unto
right.
them for the worlds that they're being in. And yeah,
And this ties into what you're thinking about love.
yeah, there's a huge thing, you know, one of the things that I get all the time in these groups that I organize, which of course we'll get into more later, so maybe I'll just speak more broadly, but I constantly get people because I live in a very politicized political sphere, like on purpose. That's my main interest. So I usually draw crowds or friends or make communities based around that. Not necessarily recommended for everybody, of course, but I find myself in a lot of those spaces. And don't get me wrong, I can turn it off and I ought to, and we should in certain situations, of course. But I get this question all the time. It's like, what can we do or what do we do? And of course, the same question you and I were asking all those years ago when we met. Maybe we thought we had more of an answer then, but we were still in that kind of mode of thinking about that. Uh,
Mm.
that kind of subject to the pseudo activity is of course something we can go into later as well. But
Right.
I've come up with,
What do we do to not be in that mode of pseudo activity was a big question. Even then, to the point where I think, some of the absurd things that we did were because we were aware that we wanted to do something, but we also knew that anything we did was going to be absurd. So to a certain point, we were just embracing that absurdity. Right. So, I mean,
Mhm.
it is, I think, part of why we both, in our own ways, gravitate towards absurdist comedy or art, right?
It is really interesting. I look forward to in the future how we can play on the literal shared dynamic of physical space you and I have had, even kind of pre the modes we're in now, too.
Yeah.
Because I mean, you even just bringing that up very vaguely brings to mind like how much shit we were really doing that kind of uh, matches some of this. But in that we were so less guided. It was so distracted. There was so much chaos. We were just like fucking throwing darts. There wasn't even a board. We were just throwing them. And that's cool. Most people don't get to experience that level of awareness of how fucked everything is, and therefore just kind of try throwing shit out there. But all that to
Like the
say,
time that you climbed out of a window from your math class so that you could run
oh
to the
yeah,
quad and counter protest. In doing so, a new religion or the one true religion was revealed to you. But
uh-huh.
we'll come back to that. Yeah, we'll
Discovered,
come back
yes.
to
Yeah.
discovered.
Praise be Gordon Jengis.
Yeah.
May grain be upon you. Yes. But here's this maxim though. In the spirit of Jengis, people ask, "What can you do?" And uh, I'm going to intentionally deliver this arrogantly. I have come up with the perfect response. It is this: we ought to strive to love people more. Now, the reason that is the case, to make it so succinct, to summarize the whole thing without muddying it up or overcomplicating, over philosophizing the whole thing to where it's like no longer grounded in our immediate spheres of being, is like sometimes we just need this like cold glass of water to allow the point to make it all the way home, you know, in a way that sticks and doesn't even like leave room for, I guess it can go two ways, like too many excuses or too much overinterpretation. But the thing I like about this, we ought to strive to love people more, is it's a pretty intuitive kind of yes or no question that most people can ask themselves in scenarios. It doesn't even require further elucidation or a constant checkup or anything. It's just like, okay, I'm thinking about in my activism, in my life, in my relationships, like what can I do? What do we do to make the world a better place? However grand or minuscule the question is, it's pretty easy to ask. Like, is this me loving? You know, is this me loving more on people, the world, etc.? And it's almost always, and in the spirit of Clarence Thomas and his use of pornography, like I know it when I see it. You know, it really is that way. You know, and especially if we're capable of like even being slightly honest with ourselves. And there's something really powerful about that. Of course, I could go into my whole uh, Baudrillardian diatribe on pseudoactivity and the kind of spontaneous poiesis that ought to come from engaging with the world, kind of radically, spontaneously, absurdly, blah, 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 blah. But that just gets, it leaves too much room for interpretation, for excuses, for someone who might be like me in some states where I'm just looking for an opportunity to have mental
Right.
masturbation, you
Right.
know, instead of like actually engaging with it. And when someone like me, usually the verbose philosopher in that sphere, that is my thing. They kind of view me as some kind of teacher, which I'm working very hard to dismantle in a kind of productive way. Not that I feel that we're in a cult or I'm worshipped or anything, but we also need different dynamics. Is to just ask themselves, like, we have to strive to love people more. You know what that is. There's nothing I can teach you there. It's pretty simple. Don't overthink it. Don't think like, what would Jesus do, and especially what would Bauer do, and of course the what would Jesus do, that has way more legs. That's way more important. But even just simplifying it further, not contextualizing it in all those messy ways, just we have to strive to love people more. And so when I think of building family, community, organizing, being in the world, what is a mode that can
Mm.
at least attempt to supersede the realm of pseudo-activity or spectacle, if it's more performative and virtue signaling, that we can try to get beyond? It's like shit. And I look back on some of our times. I really hope we do go more into some of those. We should have a time where we pick certain examples and kind of go through them. But the idea of like PB&J Sundays, did you ever remember when my brother and
Mm.
I were kind of taking that up? It
Hmm.
was we got lost in the sauce at some point, where every Sunday we would go to a local market. And then we were overthinking, like, okay, market is still participating in capitalism, no such thing as ethical consumption under capitalism. So let's not go to Walmart, let's go to Winco. At least it's a co-op. Okay, we have gone beyond blah, blah, blah. And then we're like, okay, we should try to buy more local foods. Okay, but the local foods are coming in plastic. Okay, we should bring our own containers and develop a relationship with blah, blah, blah. Okay, but we still have to drive down to the place to feed the houseless population. That was the goal of this thing,
We got to make
PB&J
sure that the
Sundays. It was
peanut
like,
butter is
oh,
organic. I remember that. Yeah.
totally. And we
Yeah.
ought to ride our bikes. And then you get there and people have peanut allergies. So you adjust and you like, instead of carrots, we ought to do bananas, and everything was like vegan, of course. It's just, we tried to get like through every fucking possible virtue signaling thing that we could. And not to say it was proper virtue signaling. I think there was a
No.
level of genuineness there. Because
Yeah.
what we did is we went down to this space and with the houseless population congregated in this mass area, we ate with, made with, consumed with, chatted with, chortled with, all these things in communion with these people in this space, as people, as we were one of them and they were one of us. And don't even get me started on how this whole idea came. We were part of a fucking nonprofit thing at our university where they were raising thousands and thousands of dollars for the local children's cancer ward. And the first thing that hit me was, you mean for like 25,000 bucks, we can give a local kid 1 month extra life? And this is before like the whole effective altruist kind of rhetoric and stuff. But I was still thinking like, we could do a lot more with 25,000 bucks donated somewhere else. And then also that our t-shirts for the event were like made in Bangladesh. And I'm like, okay, so we're giving 1 month to a kid in Boise at the cancer ward, a very worthy target. This a slightly easier end of life care, but at the expense of destroying all these children in Bangladesh and everything. So we start that. And then, of course, like 3, 4 weeks in, very near the beginning, we show up and all of a sudden a camera crew appears. And tell me if I'm going way too off base here. I'm really running with this, but I'll
You are,
stop
but
right after
just
this anyway.
you got to finish it though.
Uh,
Do it. Yeah.
a camera crew shows up from a local news station and they're like, oh, are you here to feed the houseless population or whatever? And we're like, yeah, what are you doing here? And they're like, oh, didn't you call us? And we're like, no, why would we do that? 10 minutes later, a truck pulls up with a local pastor with a truck full of pepperoni pizza from Little Caesars, a very cheap, unhealthy, greasy kind of option, and had called the news station to come down and see him deliver all of these pizzas to these people. And to eat. And, we're just like still there doing our thing, having a conversation with them. And of course, not a word was spoken to any of the people. Dropped it off. He got the interview, was on the camera, and then disappeared, all in the time that we were still there. Anyway, all that to say, love people more. And I think that's even where the idea came from with the PB&J Sundays was
Yeah.
like, I feel like so much of this is a pseudo activity. So much of this is a performance, a kind of virtue signaling. So much of this is masked in a way that makes us feel as though we're doing something constructive when it's not. So how can we
Right.
guide ourselves differently? I didn't have the question or the answer articulated as well, but we were trying. And yes, so digression, major digression
Dude, I
over, but at
think
least I closed the circle.
that was
I
like
can always close the circle.
if the black pill is not like a single pill that you pop once, but is instead like a dose that you do over time,
Hmm.
I think that might have been one of them. was just the experiences I had going through starting out being like, oh, what is this? Yeah, I'm doing this, to being like, this is really cool, to then later being like, I think we thought we were doing a lot more than we were doing. And that, but of course, compared to that pastor, we were, right? So compared to some other, it's true that we were, which is a good sort of springboard back into being with. And I just wanted to touch on Throwness. And you'd also brought in bracketing and how important it is to do the bracketing, to even be able to bring to the foreground something like being with, that is otherwise taken for granted, but not really fleshed out, especially in this sort of politicized environment. Collectivity versus individuality get juxtaposed. People tend to take a side. If you're super nuanced or not, you might be able to be some kind of a centrist who's like, oh, but it takes both. And obviously, in some sort of sense, it does. The idea of being with, though, goes far before all of that. And it's very specifically going before. But before I get into it, I want to do a quick little recap from last time, where I did a lot of sort of biographical stuff. I talked a lot about Husserl and Dilthey, and I said the whole thing about how, we've got Descartes doing his hyperbolic doubt against scholasticism and sort of Western tradition, right? Against traditionalism, you could say, opening up the space for hopefully a more harmonious relation to science. But then Husserl will come along and be like, yes, but also naturalism needs to be bracketed against because, since Darwin, we've had this, especially in the wake of Descartes, we've had this tendency to just always assume the natural, and that's fine, except that done within this dualistic framework, we're missing how all of this stuff is a product of intentionality, as well as these other things that he gets into. And then Heidegger comes in and is like, yes, but now we have to bracket against both scientism and tradition, right? We have to bracket against both. And part of bracketing against both, the way that he takes up and radicalizes the Cartesian and Husserlian projects, is to think a lot deeper about presuppositions and to basically say the issue with why they're not able to really prove the world in the first place is that to even frame the idea that we need to prove the world, or that the world is, to get to the point where you're like, I can prove myself before I can prove the world. To get to that point, you've already presupposed an approach that has left behind or left out of its analysis too many presuppositions. At the point that you're having these kinds of logical problems, the issue is not that you don't have presuppositions, it's that you've actually got too few presuppositions. Being in the world is like this master presupposition that he wants to build out before getting to some of these fundamental questions that philosophers will ask, right? So before we could even ask the question of like, what is being, we first have to ask who's asking the question, and what do we know for sure about who is asking the question before we do anything else. And what one thing that we know for sure about Dasein, it's always somewhere. It's not this abstraction. It's always somewhere. It's always being there. And where is it being? Well, it's in the world, right? Well, the in the world we'll get into is synonymous with this being with. But before we do that, just a quick recap. Disclosedness. We talked about the structure of disclosedness in the world being between Verstehen, Befindlichkeit, and Rede, which roughly translates as understanding, attunement, and discourse. Though, I say attunement, the McKerracher and Robinson says state of mind. I also like to, instead of saying understanding, I like to say modal understanding, because it has to do with your possibilities, not with your comprehension, though it is the ground of your possibilities of comprehension, of course. And then Rede, I think maybe eventually we could leave behind discourse altogether as the word, because when people think of discourse, what they're thinking of is going to be so different, when what he's getting at is something a lot more like the symbolic order. And so one way of saying it is modal understanding is equiprimordial to our always already being attuned to the world, to some color of the world, which is itself always within the context of language and the symbolic order. But where we find ourselves when we first start trying to take responsibility for our engagement with and in the world, which is to say, become some kind of a self-possessed thinker, right? We find ourselves spiraling between these kinds of within and between these conversations where words get handed around in an ambiguous way, and where people are expressing a kind of curiosity about stuff. In fact, they might be thoroughly enthused by the world. They're excited about the world, but nobody's really committing to getting to the bottom of things. And in fact, there's like this fear that if you commit too much, you'll be weird or left behind. You won't be able to keep up with the Joneses, with whatever's trending. And so we stay locked into idle chatter. And this is not just when we're with other people in an ontical, which is to say empirical way. It's also when we're not with others. And that's where I want to read off this quote. Actually, how much of it do we really want to do? It's on page 156. I'm going to share it in the chat here. And maybe I'll have you read the first half of it. Maybe I'll bring back the second half of it later. But there you go, Doctor.
You would like me to read it?
Yes, please.
Such an honor. Okay. The phenomenological assertion that Dasein is essentially being with has an existential ontological meaning. It does not seek to establish ontically that factically I am not present at hand alone and that others of my kind occur. If this were what is meant by the proposition that Dasein's being in the world is essentially constituted by being with, then being with would not be an existential attribute which Dasein, of its own accord, has coming to it from its own kind of being. It would rather be something which turns up in every case by reason of the occurrence of others. Being with is an existential characteristic of Dasein, even when factically no other is present at hand or perceived.
Thank you.
I miss reading Heidegger, but also I don't.
Yeah. Yeah, I only miss it at this point, but I only get to have it in small doses here and there because you can't teach the whole class on it all the time, right? Which is why part of the subscriber benefits package now is like higher tier subscribers. We can do, let's pick a chapter and just we'll read it and talk about it. You know what I mean? Like that can help a person who's been reading it but is lost and wondering if they're getting the right thing out of it or whatever. But just to zoom in on it here. So being with is an existential characteristic of Dasein, even when factically no other is present at hand or perceived. Okay. So he's not deducing that we are with others off of the empirical observation that there are others. No. In fact, you in your solitude and or loneliness, I use these as opposite terms almost, right? Your loneliness or your fullness of being with yourself. In either case, this is a determinate relation to the other, right? To others, to the world of others. You're even, I always say as a hermit, your hermitage is in relation to society, right? You chose to go out there and live as a hermit because of your relation to society. So you might leave society behind, but society is haunting everything about your mode. Even if you were to say, forget about society, at some point you completely rewild yourself. Well, this is all still on the basis of your social being in the sort of sense that he is using it here. So ontically would have to do with what's empirically observable, whereas ontologically gets to the conditions of possibility for that ontical observation in the first place. We are only able to encounter others because we are already the kind of being who is with others, in the sense that he's using it here. So, I mean, I said at the beginning, this episode on of being with here. I'm gonna, who am I with right now? And it's like, it's you, right? Well, also there's the people who have their cameras off who are present. Well, there's also the virtual people who could watch this later, asynchronously, right, on demand. Yeah, but it goes even beyond all that. It goes to those we have bracketed out entirely, and those who spoke this language long before it sounded the way it does today, right? The language being of Dasein itself is something that we find ourselves thrown into. So a quick little speed run through Throwness and falling in projection. These three things are also equiprimordial. So we already talked about our modal understanding always already being attuned, and the symbolic order being equiprimordial, equally original, equally primordial. Well, in the same way, we find ourselves thrown into a world of ambiguity, curiosity, idle chatter. We're thrown into a world of language. We're thrown into wherever it is, your historical context. Now, that also includes your family, right? Your family, your society. So we'll want to come back to the question of family and its determinate, sort of perennial, primordial role here. But that's not what Heidegger is going to get into. He's not going to bring up the family once in this entire book, I don't think. Read it multiple times. I don't remember any mention of the family. And that's actually kind of, that's interesting, right? He brackets out whether man is created in the image of God or monkeys. Like, he brackets out these kinds of questions, these metaphysical positions. He brackets them out entirely, but he doesn't bracket out the family. He brackets out taking up a biological, psychological, or anthropological approach to the human. He brackets those out right in the first chapter, but he doesn't bracket out the family. So he doesn't bracket it out, but he also leaves it out, which makes me think that it's one of those presuppositions that gets under theorized, under prioritized, right? I think he's thinking of Dasein from this sort of Kierkegaardian, Nietzschean sort of individualist perspective, but he wants to imminently critique it, and in doing so, get to the Volk. But the thing is like, yeah, that Volk, the Volksgemeinschaft, that itself is what? It only makes any sense to us in the first place on an analogy to the family, right? The state, the nation state, throughout the history of the West with political philosophers, they will often go back to this metaphor of the family, right? The king is seen as a sort of father of the province, and then of course, as is God to the church. So this is all based on an analogy, right? An analogy that only gets its traction, its intuitive weight, because we are the kinds of beings who are thrown into families. And this would go for orphans just as much. You are, in that case, haunted by the family that you maybe will never have the ability to meet, right? Like that's going to be a formative part of your journey, is that realization. And so this doesn't leave out those who, in some empirical, ontical sense, lack a family. That lack is itself only discernible on the basis of you already ontologically being the kind of being who comes from natality, who requires nurture and has, to some extent, probably been neglected from that nurture. And that would be, I think, a shared experience with people. Most people probably have some experience of some kind of neglect at the level of nurture. Not necessarily in the family. Some people are very privileged, very lucky to have extremely loving families. But nurture itself in a society that is structurally stultified of its time energy becomes obstructed, right? But like I said, he doesn't get into this. Thrownness is more about you're thrown into a world, which is to say a language, which is a place in time, right? But we're also thrown into falling. So thrownness is equiprimordial to falling in projection. So the speed run version of this is just to say that this thrownness has to do with the past. We are thrown into this. It's sort of a past tense thing. We're here now, sure, but we got here. Thrownness has to do with the fact that we got to where we are. And falling has to do with where we find ourselves, which is if you're not constantly taking action and working on yourself, it's really easy to let yourself go, right? In fact, by the time that you realize you want to take over your projection, which is to say your way forward onto the horizon of possibilities, you probably realize, oh, I've not been doing this very actively and I've acquired a lot of bad habits and now I have to wrestle with those. And then some of those you're going to constantly, as I got to last time, you're going to constantly take on the challenge of changing this, that, or the other, and then you'll fall back into your old ways, right? And so sometimes some are going to be easier, some are going to be harder. This is all what we're getting at. And I think it ties directly to the idea of grace and love because, having grace towards the other and just being like, oh, there, but for the grace of God go I, that sort of attitude of, oh, it could have been me and I should just love that person is one thing. It's another thing to realize we're all in this. We've all been thrown into falling, right? We've all been thrown into falling and there's not a switch from being, there's no magical moment of I was inauthentic and now I live actively. I deliberately choose my possibilities now. There's no switch and now you're a changed person forever. It's instead this sort of constant slippage, this constant sense of falling back into old habits, because by the time you find yourself thrown into, say, Plato's cave, for instance, right? You've already acquired a habitus. Yeah. So that's the speed run. Thrownness, falling, and projection are equiprimordial, and they map to having been, being present, and the yet to come, or the incoming, we could say, right? Which is basically to say past, present, and future, right? But for Heidegger, it always kind of starts on the basis of we find ourselves in the present. And in a sort of sense, it's easy to stay locked into a present that only thinks in terms it only thinks of the past or the future in terms of the definite has been as a set of facts, the past as a set of facts, history as a set of facts, versus the future, which is just like, oh, anything's possible. And is the present is what we know for sure. And he's saying more important than the ontic possibilities in the future or the ontic actualities, the facts of the past, is the fact that in the present, we are not unsevered or disconnected. Or sorry, we're not severed or disconnected. Oh no, Bauer lost his internet. So I'll just switch it over here. Yeah, it looked like he was lagging out there. So I'm going to go ahead and pause. Look, I found Bauer. He's back. Welcome back.
Thank you. Good to be here. First time, long time.
Right. We're all thrown into this world where internet can be like that.
I was thrown out. Yeah.
You were thrown out. We're all thrown into a world where we are being thrown out all the time.
By the bouncer of being, yes.
Yeah. Are you on Starlink right now? Is that what it is?
No.
We can't blame
we're
Elon.
Just on countryside bumpkin internet. We are out here in the depths of the Finnish forests, and there's a little rainstorm, of course, and it's summer, so the leaves actually play a role in affecting our internet speeds. But right. I love it.
Well, yeah, I'm on bumpkin internet as well, and so it can also get rocky here because, but we are on the Starlink, so which makes which makes it possible to have higher speeds than what is otherwise available out here. But satellite can just be rocky; it can be wavy by its very nature. But I think where you cut out, I was talking about Throwness, falling, and projection. And I was saying this relates to grace and love, tying it back to what you were talking about. TU is building a studio. I have officially cleared ground. I've been working on it for the last several months on and off, but am, as of this last week, beginning to get a lot more traction on the project because more money has come in. So thank you so much for those who have already contributed via donations for the TU studio. It's going to happen no matter what, but the question is when. If you want to help speed up the process, make things smoother sailing, and help me keep creating the kinds of content that you love, and even better, the kinds of content that is to come. There's a whole new era getting rolled out. If you want to help make it possible and usher it in smoother and faster, the best way to do that is to make a donation via the Zelle link up on the screen here. You see that QR code? Use that QR code. Once you have an account, that QR code should take you to where you can make the bank transfer with zero charge, which is really sweet, huh? Yeah, we love that. That's why we're using Zelle. Thank you so much for helping make this possible. Saying this relates to grace and love, tying it back to what you were talking about, because there's a superficial version of what that means, like, oh, there, but for the grace of God go I. That could have been me. We should be empathetic because you don't know what the other person is going through. And then also this sort of more fleshed out idea, which is just like, oh yeah, I am constantly falling off my own attempts to seize projection. I am also falling back into my habitus. It's not just a question of how much of an advantage in life I might have, talking about some kind of a privilege that you might have, which might be a factor, but it's also, especially in this sort of being in the world approach Heidegger's employing or helping us see. There is no light switch moment where now you are authentic. And I think a lot of people get this idea that, for Heidegger, there are authentic people and there are inauthentic people. And it's just like, no, inauthenticity is this base reality. This average everydayness is a base reality. It is a way of touching base with others. It is the basis of common sense itself. It is just normal humanity. That's not it. This is base reality. And this is why it's such a problem when Adorno critiques Heidegger without really ever engaging with Heidegger, except for just kind of vaguely pointing at Heidegger in the jargon of authenticity, where it's like, he starts off talking about this group that meets up in Chicago, and the name of their group is the Authentic Ones. And of course, he's having a laugh at this. And it's like, yeah, that's cringe. And Heidegger obviously would agree with you. Like, he doesn't think that that group's going to have any sort of monopoly on authenticity. And the point is that we do have to be deliberate. We do have to be deliberate about our lives, and that requires reminders, and it requires seeing other people do it, right? Seeing other people do it can sort of show you possible ways of doing it for yourself. That's another way that you are being with others. So you are obviously always already seeing a whole horizon of possibilities laid out for you. You could be a doctor, you could be a lawyer, you could drive a dump truck, whatever it is, you see these possibilities and you're like, yeah. And those are sort of Dossmann, they sort of average possibilities. But also you might see somebody do something that was never, ever laid out as a possible path forward. No one told anyone that you could do this thing, and this person is doing that thing, and only that person could do that thing. And that doesn't mean, oh, well, now you have unlocked the ability to do what they're doing. No, only they can do what they're doing. The point is that seeing someone do something that only they can do could make you realize that only you can do something as well. There might be possibilities that, as Heidegger says, are your own most possibilities. And I think he thinks that these own most possibilities are going to be revealed almost like a calling. If you are sort of using the acid bath to strip away the they's possibilities, the acid bath of anxiety, right? So instead of living in fear, which we experience as a superficial, non-committal curiosity, that's our way of running from fear. It's just to kind of stay detached and mildly curious, or even ironic, I would say. We're instead, I like the term acid bath. I'm not sure if that's really clear. Is that clear for you? Does that make sense to call it an acid bath, to say anxiety is sort of going to just strip away these other
I think
possibilities?
it does to me. I might
Okay.
work to differentiate it further from bracketing, at least, because it sounds like it can be a metaphor that goes over, even though you're using it for something else.
Yeah,
But
I mean,
otherwise, it makes sense.
it might sort of bracket away the they's possibilities. Like, for instance, I'll just use the example of my parents turning 70, right? My dad turned 69 yesterday, and it was a realization a couple years ago. Yeah, the realization a couple years ago that as they enter their 70s, I might miss my possibility here, the opportunity to sort of build this relationship with them now, and to be there for them before it's too late. Not just too late in the sense that they will someday die, but more importantly, that they will calcify. And just anyone entering their 70s, this is true of all humans, anyone entering their 70s, if they're not engaging with new people, or people who bring natality, which is to say newness, into their life, and if those people aren't there to kind of keep them on their toes, they can kind of just wilt into this sort of thing where, people talk about, dementia or Alzheimer's, but that's a sort of, diagnostic way of describing what's happening. In I think an existential sense, the idea is you're getting locked into a habitus that is, that forgets its being with, and loses touch with its roots in the past, at the same time that it loses a sense for, oh, but we're still projecting here, baby. Right. And it's like, by being in an intergenerational relation with other people, you are able to remember the past with other people, where they can, oh, well, I remember it this way. No, wait, did it happen like that? Oh, and when did that happen? And, those kind of questions can keep you grounded. But then also the reinterpretation of those, like, oh, I've learned a lot since then, and now I think about this that way. And then how that changes how I'm seeing the future. Right. And so Heidegger's going to say that it's not that we, on the basis of the past, see how to navigate the future. He actually does it the complete reversal, right? So it's the opposite of what a person who's thinking of him as a reactionary would assume, right? Typically with a reactionary, you're going to think, oh, they want to go back to the past. He's saying, no, actually, it's very like Marx. You go to the past to find tools, to find inspiration, to find something, but you're only looking in the first place because you are in relation to the future. It's because you are trying to navigate the future that you're even looking to the past at all in the first place, right? It gives you something more to work with. But anyway, bringing it back to the idea of finitude being this acid bath, I'm saying that, I
Real
want
quick too,
I
would you
would,
say that this metaphor of your parents is more in line with explaining Heidegger's like inauthenticity concept too?
which
Like
part?
that
What do you
the
mean?
the analogy we're talking of, like them kind of aging if you weren't there. I mean, it could be any person going into their 70s and losing connection to the past and a sense of
Right,
rudeness, but
right.
also getting calcified. Yes, this is
Yeah,
more what Heidegger means by inauthentic existence in the existential sphere than what we would usually, or like the pop Heidegger is said to be, is like,
right,
no, seek to be yourself and find an authentic true self. No, it's a mode of being.
right, right.
Mm.
And it's one that is shattered by others if those others are also trying to project in a deliberate way, right? Now,
Mm.
I have to be very clear. It's not like my parents were just watching TV and
Yes,
scrolling
I
on
know.
their phones.
Yeah.
In fact, this farm is a testament to the fact that they are kicking ass, projecting. But those are habits too, and the point, yeah, you're exactly right though, that you definitely can slip into a sort of inauthentic presentist way of being, that loses its thread from future to past in its being with others. Yeah. And so that acid bath part, just to sort of close that out, is to say, it was sort of this bucket of ice water, because Anne and I were thinking very seriously about moving to where you are, to Finland. That's it's just convenient. It just kind of worked out. It's serendipity that it's you who's here today, because I wasn't even thinking about this up until this moment, but it's like, no, we were going to literally move there or two other places. We were looking at 3 different places for sort of grad school programs, PhD kind of stuff, which are obviously possibilities that can be your own most. Obviously, like it's what you do with it. It's what you make of it. But the finitude factor is what made us realize, we could do that later. We can't do this with mom and dad later. And that's not to say that we can have our cake and eat it too, though, either. Kierkegaard is correct. Sometimes it really isn't either or, and we'll never be the ages that we are now. Again, this is a decision where it's like, once we've pushed the go button and done everything we've done up to this point, there is no going back, right? There's never any going back. So, yeah. So what are your own most possibilities, right? And how are you going to project? And so the how of projection is something that I want to come back to next time with Bauer, where we're going to talk. We'll be reading some classification struggles by Pierre Bourdieu, and that'll be the sort of exegetical side of things, a sort of meta side of things. But in a sort of meta touching grass way, one of the things that we wanted to do together here is work with you all who are watching this, who are listening, who are thinking about what you're doing in the world. And the question is like, how are you projecting? What are your own most possibilities? And how do you break out of just being a follower or an enjoyer of a channel, or even a student as a subscriber or a member at TU? How do you break out of just that and also get into organizing yourself? And we're not proposing everyone will want to organize necessarily ever or in the next month or couple years, but organizing is something that even if you don't feel especially called to do it, well, you wouldn't even hear that call if you didn't think about it a little deeper, right? The chances are you wouldn't really hear that call if you didn't at least think about it deeper. And so at least at the level of keeping an open mind and thinking about what's possible. And of course, there's different ways of organizing, but what we're talking about in particular is organizing with other people. And so we'll have a how where we get into some of the practical logistical stuff. But for right now, I just kind of want to make this segue from being in the world shattered in the age of the post-class fractured mass, the PCFM. Being in the world shattered into the age of the PCFM. What do we do now that we find ourselves thrown into this, where the entire system, and typically I focus on specific aspects, the gerrymandering of the Befindlichkeit, the medium itself, and then the schooling system as a meritocracy and how it programs us with a certain habitus and a certain way of thinking about learning and educational attainment that further fractures, right? Teaches us our place, so to speak. And it teaches us to either love or hate certain subjects, when in reality, those usually have very little to do with the subject matters themselves and has a lot more to do with teacher personality types and your ability to achieve or not on certain kinds of tests, like exams or what have you. So, these are all huge factors in the fracturing of the PCFM. So what do we do in that situation, right? Embrace it, go with it, just say, well, everything's pseudo-activity now. Simulacrum simulation all the way down, as Bauer was alluding to. or nonetheless try to do something that breaks out of or goes beyond the gerrymandering of Befindlichkeit, the inherent noxious tendencies of the medium, or the reproduction of the schooling system in our interpersonal sort of click-based lives. And I say click-based, not like clicking things like clickbait, but I mean clicking like you click up with other people in affinity groups, right? So what are ways of breaking out of that? Well, we'll talk about what some of our own ideas are for new ways of organizing that are neither schools nor churches, our own ways of organizing across differences represented within this sort of plural world. We'll talk about the hows and also hopefully get you all to share ideas as well. But for right now, I want to talk a little bit more about the why of doing it. And I've obviously said a lot. So really, wherever you want to take it from here, Bauer, I think that this is the phase where we kind of just move into talking about the cultivating the grounds for worldhood, right? Not just working with what is, where we've been thrown and what we're in the midst of, but also like why project.
How kind of free sailing do you want me to kind of riff on
Whatever,
that?
dude. Yeah, whatever.
Okay. So it's interesting because that direct question, which is a really great question, I don't think I necessarily have like notes specifically prepared for that, but maybe that's better because I feel as though I have more of an intuition of that. So like why do anything, right? We have the question like what do we do? What can we do? I have that soundbite kind of vulgarized answer, the we ought to strive to love more. But why? Why do this? Um, I'm gonna turn on my pragmatist hat, and yes, like capital P, real pragmatist, not like it was funny when you were talking about Heidegger and how authenticity seems to be one of the most popularized ways he's totally bastardized. And I know with all of our favorite thinkers, there's always that one way they're popularized that is like totally fucking off base. For pragmatism, I'm gonna make the case, like everyone does with their favorite thinkers, there's no school of thought in modern discourse that is more bastardized, whereas at least the bastardizations are more specific and nefarious with things like Heidegger or Levinas, et cetera, et cetera. But with pragmatism, it's like the entire oeuvre, the whole vibe of pragmatism is entirely vulgarized. There's not a single thread in popular discourse that gets any aspect of it right. But here's the thing. When I think of especially theory praxis, why? I think of how in pragmatism they would kind of use different words that get at the same thing. And it would be something like action and inquiry. So inquiry would be the theory and action would be the praxis. But because this is more brought about by Dewey, the most Hegelian of the, oh, sorry, I said I wouldn't say Hegel. I
Oh
already
yeah.
said it. Don't worry, I'm not going down that train. But the most Hegelian of the pragmatists and my favorite for sure when it comes to proper philosophy. He wants to see the immanence, the equiprimordial nature of inquiry and action. And when we think of it that way, he really strips away the excuse for those who want to stay in the world of mental masturbation, those who want to stay in the world of deep, the kind of, I don't know, whether it be to the level of jouissance that we do our theory explorations, or just a kind of self-importance, self-aggrandizement, whatever it might be, or to blot out the intolerable situation of the world that we're in, and this is our new kind of addiction or cope, et cetera, et cetera. He's like, no, 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 no. You think, so for those stuck in theory, you think you're doing actual inquiry. You think you're doing actual theory. But here's the capital P pragmatist part. It has to be operationalized. It has to be, I want to say something like methodologized, but that's too much in the realm of like instrumental reason language. So I really, really want us to bracket out that for a moment, that I'm using a scientific word, but in a very, very different context. So maybe operationalize is better than methodologize. But for Dewey, it's all about method, but in a very peculiar sense. So we have inquiry. If we're inquiring about something, that's true theory at the level that someone like Dave and I really want to elevate it to. It's not just reading and engaging with difficult thoughts, having fun discourse around the coffee table with your buddies. It's like really deeply thinking about this stuff. And in order for it to count as such, there must, and this is a must, an ought, a should, a shall, there must be an element of action. Inquiry without action. It reminds me of an old adage I've been saying for a while that's only tangentially related, but I often think of the dichotomy of like science and art. And when I think of like theory without praxis as blah, 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 or praxis without theory is blah, 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 I think it's important to bring in a different analogy too. I think of science without art is the nuclear bomb. And art without science is your local contemporary abstract art museum full of unemployed rural artists. It's like there ought to be some kind of overlap. There are things they can get from one another, and without each other, they kind of render themselves meaningless
But
without a kind of goal. Mhm.
it's the test of the real itself, right? And that's this. I
Exactly.
know that for Dewey, like he thinks that Bacon is the bee's knees, right? And so I think it's Bacon talks about like force and resistance, right? There's
Hmm.
force and resistance. Without resistance, you have no approximation of like or any indication of a reality outside of the concept. So it's just like there's a concept, but it's resistance against force where you go, oh, there's something there pushing back, right?
Exactly. I love that you brought that in because it can help me narrow in a bit more on like you, I want to think of the concept like worthiness or worthwhile. And that's the kind of thing we're almost like testing our inquiry, our theorizing. And until not just like seeing if the theory is good and therefore we operationalize it and test it. That's the kind of more vulgar form of pragmatism. But more like I'm just going to say theorizing the act itself is no good without the action element. It's more like that.
Right.
We can get to whether your theories are good or bad, et cetera, all that normative stuff, your
Right.
comparative stuff later down the line. That's not what we're concerned with here. It's kind of like bracketing in a sense where we're taking one step further back. We're not just entering the sphere of the marketplace of ideas or all that kind of capitalist bullshit that we see dominating the narrative today. It's more like, are you really theorizing at all if there isn't an action component to it? And that is proper theorizing. So,
Mm-hmm.
yes, we can get to the weeds later. But this concept of action in the pragmatist sense, I think, is so wonderful because it it imminently includes, there's the equiprimordial inclusion of inquiry inside of it, or else, in the same way, inversely, it does not count as action if there is no real inquiry. So we also get past this pseudo-activity spectacle side of things, of just the kind of actions or praxis that we see today. Um, and it's kind of a nice way of getting beyond this. Just like the phenomenology and existential side of Heidegger and that whole kind of school there, slightly before and definitely after, it's getting beyond the kind of like boring analytical tests. Like, does this hold up in a court of law? Is there a methodological end goal that gets us from point A to point B? And that was our goal all along. It's more like, why are you starting at A? What are we doing here? Like, we need to first get there. And so why? I'll say one more thing, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on any of this rambling, but I want to go back to worthiness for a moment. If I am inquiring about something and I don't necessarily see a way I can operationalize it, now don't judge that by a grand scale, like, oh, I'm going to get elected to be president of the United States, or oh, I'm going to have a policy that gives Medicare for all. Think even smaller, just for the meantime. Go back to the natality sphere, go back to the family. Can I
Mm.
operationalize my inquiries in a way that develop a sense, a real world sense of family in my immediate sphere? Okay, that's much more present. That's much more immediate here. Uh, if the answer is no, which usually the intuition will play itself out, but sometimes you do need to operationalize it and find out, okay, this shit's not working. But
Right.
it gives us that excuse to revisit, like, okay, not only have I been inquiring about the wrong things, maybe I haven't been properly inquiring at all. And so it's worthwhile. Is it worthwhile? The worthiness.
Well, and you said the issue with talking about operationalizing and sort of a methodological approach is that both in various ways are going to give people like this overly scientific sort of sense for what we're trying to get at, right? Like where, if maybe you come from a specific discipline, those words have a very specific, usage or connotation. But phenomenology is not metaphysics. And of course, people will say, well, Heidegger's doing ontology. It's a bit more of a humble approach to metaphysics. You're still talking about fundamental reality, but you're not as speculative. You're not as wide sweeping. You're really zooming in on specific things. And it's like, well, yeah, okay. But more importantly, he is utilizing a method. And I've been laughed out of the room at least once by somebody who just thought it was the funniest thing that I'd said that Heidegger even has a method, right? But of course, if you read the history of the concept of time, which is the lectures that he's giving right before he writes Being in Time, he spends chapters talking about the method. And, bracketing's just one component. I've only focused on one. I am oversimplifying. Everything I've done so far at TU, all of it is oversimplification. It's just to get you going. It's to give some kind of a foothold. And the point is that a method between inquiry and action, or we could hyphenate them, inquiring action. The method is really important. And so people think, oh, well, there's theory, and then we operationalize it in praxis. And then what we learn in that praxis, we then take back to our theory, and it's dialectical, that's a typical
Fichtean kind of thing. Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
This is how people will think about it. Right.
Mathematical form. Yeah, for sure.
But even in that case, it's just true that nothing goes the way that you plan. And everyone knows this. Practical life is the opposite of how it looks on paper. People know this. Everyone who is a practical person out there in the world is going to look at you and just be like, oh, sounds good on paper. Oh, yeah. And of course, what they're getting at is the fact that they do things and nothing ever goes the way that they plan. And then they learn on the ground that it's going to be different than they had presumed. Right? That's just a normal thing. And then welcome, Stephen. We're going to have hold on one sec.
That we would have a method at all. Yeah.
Right. So people who are practical as opposed to theoretical are going to just roll their eyes at people who are primarily intellectual, which is to say usually theoretical. And of course, intellectuals in a sort of empirical vein are also going to roll their eyes at theory, right? I don't care about your grand theory. Like, show me. Like, what can you actually show me that you've done?
Liberal death blow is that's not practical. It could literally be tattooed on other foreheads, just walking around with that smug sense of righteousness. You now know where I stand. But that, yes, how many times? And bringing in back the concept of worthwhile and worthiness, we can use it in response to that too, because they just instinctually, almost like a fucking machine, dispel onto the world. That's not practical. By definition, they go, that's not worthwhile. There's no worthiness there.
Right.
And that's where it connects. Yeah.
Right. But also truth and beauty are not necessarily practical. Ideals are not necessarily practical. But of course, an ideal might rupture our entire sense of what's practical and change how we approximate the future in our co-projection. So with that though, the trial of the real, the actually, saying, okay, yeah, a perfect example here would be when people say, well, the way you said that, Dave, most people wouldn't be able to make sense of what you just said. And of course, I'm like, yeah, I know. Like, I'm talking to you. Can you make sense of what I just said? And if not, how about you ask me to clarify myself? And then, of course, you have to make these decisions when you're speaking on the internet, because there's always going to be this onlooker or person who drops in who obviously has no idea what you're talking about. And so people get really neurotic about saying anything because, oh, well, someone's not going to understand what I'm saying. And then, of course, with theory, this becomes a bigger problem. Oh, you're using jargon. And it's like, yeah, I'm using technical concepts. Turns out you actually have to break out of ambiguity and get to anything. But of course, it'll also seem ambiguous to people who are on the outside of the language. And so what I'm getting at, though, is that from the armchair, it's very easy to do this sort of, oh, well, poo-poo what someone else is doing because someone else has made a decision and now is employing it. And then you're sitting there going, oh, well, you see, that's open to problems. But the thing is anybody who's doing stuff already knows and is working away at it nonetheless, right? So anytime that you say, I have a plan, there's an easy way to poo-poo the plan. And it can come from people who consider themselves practical or theoretical. It doesn't matter. The point is until you have tried to make things happen repeatedly for decades, it's just a waste of time. You could basically keep yourself on the couch in a sort of analysis paralysis. Oh, well, that could lead to this problem. Well, this could lead to that problem. And then nothing ever actually happens. Right? People get stuck. And so, if peanut butter and jelly sundaes under the bridge isn't the thing that's going to save the world or whatever, well, guess what, though? It got us out there. It was something, right? And I think it's easy to look at something and say, well, that's pseudo-activity. See, that's pseudo-activity. Well, yeah. There might be a gradient of pseudo-activity, though. There might be certainly, obviously, it was a lot more pseudo-activity when that pastor had the news crew show up. That's even more pseudo-activity, right? So but more importantly, I would say something is only really pseudo-activity retroactively. We can only really say later that it was pseudo-activity if it did not inform the participants. Not the onlookers. The onlookers are going to be like, oh, well, it's just this, it's just that. Oh, it has this problem, it has that problem. The more important question is, yes, but for the people who are taking action, how does it change things for them? And if it doesn't ever change anything for them, I would say that's falling. They're thrown into this falling. They're not really projecting. That is just sort of this pseudo activity. If it's not changing the way they go forward. And so where I'm at right now, I don't want to do a philosophy club. I don't want to do a book discussion. I don't want to do this sort of mixed, sport and philosophy kind of thing that I did with Equilibrium. I don't really, well, why do I not want to do all that? Well, it's because I did these things. I did these things a lot in various contexts, multiple times, to the point where I'm like, yeah, no, I want to try new things. And so one of the examples of that would be early risers. I want to talk about early risers. We'll come back to it. But early risers was something I tried early this year, just for a few months. And it's already given me a sort of sense for ways that I can now do other things. But it's something that you're feeling out, right? It's something that is not just, I cooked up a theory and now I'm going to apply it. Because no, it has to do with your sense for what's possible, which, as I really emphasized last time, that's in your gut, right? What we're doing is we're calibrating our gut sense for things. It's a modal calibration, and it can only be calibrated against actual other people. And so if we're talking about organizing beyond, I'll just say beyond. If we're organizing beyond this sort of gerrymandering of hyper niche interest groups and political affects, we're going to bring a lot of problems that obstruct that to the table, into everything that we do. So it's never going to look like what you say from the outset. Yeah, I think that's kind of what I'm getting at. And I think you've been doing what you've been doing now more recently. How do I want to say this? I kind of want to ask the groups that you're currently doing. How young are they? because my sense for you is that you've done a ton of IRL organizing. I know you from a time, or I knew you during a time when you were doing a lot of it. And then you moved, you did grad school, got degrees, you did other kinds of stuff. And now it's my impression is you've dived into doing a lot more in the last year. Is that right?
Uh, I compared to the couple years before it. So I had just moved to Finland 3 years ago, last month in June, and there was a time where we were really settling, and I was kind of setting up a life. I'm in a very long-term committed relationship at a very mature
Mm-hmm.
stage I've never fully reached before. We bought a house. That's half of the reason we're out in the countryside. It's the only place we can afford one anymore. But of course, it was our dream, so we get the best of both worlds: the cheaper place and the place we want more. But uh, I was living in this space of just kind of shit to do around the house and in the forest and on the lake and in the paths and with the dogs and at the trails and on the bike and everything like that, picking all the berries and doing all the cross country skiing and stuff. And there was a time of kind of unintentional retreat that was not necessarily recognized at the forefront of my mind. And then there came a point where I was teetering on that edge where I was like, okay, I've been in a place like this before where I know I'm slightly more lonely than I'm used to, but I haven't yet gone over the edge and lost my fucking mind. I have experienced that once in my life, more against my will. We can get to that at some other time, but I was aware enough of going like, okay, I'm not going to wait until I get there, obviously. So I'm just going to start something up. And it was a slow and steady process. There were many kinds of iterations along the way. But first, I reached out to the thing called the folk schools here and kind of opened up. That's a whole other side discussion we could
It's
have. This
awesome.
brilliant kind of
Awesome. Yeah.
medium that exists in particularly Finland and Denmark. But I reached out to teach a philosophy course. It got my, juices flowing, made me feel really good, all that kind of stuff. Um, and then there was a little bit of a subsiding. I joined a hockey group and started playing with them, etc. But after a time, it was like, no, I need something more. So I tried with music, and I kept running into these barriers that everyone here is into black metal and straight up heavy metal, which, if you know anything about the tiny, pedantic fucking differences between the metal subgenres, I despise those, even though my
Yeah.
favorite genres are like metalcore and maybe progressive melodic metal, gent, post-hardcore, etc.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
my
Yeah.
dad would be like, it all sounds the same. But that was kind
No,
of
but
failing because I was never really connecting.
it's so big. It's
Yeah,
so big though.
massive,
It's like
massive.
it's like
Yes,
people
I'd rather die on that hill than any political project. Yeah.
dude, people hear they overhear something that I'm listening to that goes hard, and then they just instantly go into like this stuff, and I'm like,
I
I'm
love
sorry.
Hoobastank. Yeah. Have you ever heard of Disturbed? Yeah.
Or no,
Metallica. Yeah.
they'll bring in some like I don't know gore, or I don't know, just like something that I'm just
Sure.
like I don't care, man. Like that is
Yeah. No.
so far afield to me. It's the
Remind me of
narcissism
that
of
a
small
band I need to
differences,
tell you
but these
about.
are fucking
Mhm.
major. And that is exactly I just the the segue back is the idea of gerrymandering Befindlichkeit, which I've talked about vaguely a lot on the channel. I'm writing a book this year in which I've spent a few chapters unpacking that in various ways. But one thing to keep in mind in the context of part one and parts two here of being in the world, when we're thinking of disclosedness as this sort of the ontological ground for all the ontical things that we experience in our average everydayness, Vestirhen is equiprimordial to Befindlichkeit and Rede, which means they can go in any order. Well, that means a symbolic order and our modal understanding of our possibilities. Or equiprimordial to Befindlichkeit, which is our always already being attuned, our the way that we're attuned, like musical instruments, except that attunement discloses, right? And so like what you cherry pick. So like I got in a bad mood yesterday for a couple hours, and it was just like I was just stuck in it. And I didn't want to like ruin anyone else's day, you know what I mean? I was just trying to keep it to myself because I knew that there was no real reason for the mood. It just came upon me. That's what we're talking about with Befindlichkeit. Like a mood hits you, and then you're just like, oh, here we go. And everything I see and everything I think about is just negative. And it's like, well, same thing with like some starry-eyed optimist, right? It's this it's obviously a super prejudiced way of disclosing, whether it's positive or negative, it doesn't matter. You are cherry picking from reality. Yeah, well, turns out we're all already attuned. And not just as optimists or pessimists, though that is a pretty fundamental one, not just in terms of looking forward versus looking backwards, progressive versus reactionary. These are basic kinds of attunement. And this is what Heidegger is getting at, though, of course, there's other possibilities for it as well. You know, for instance, a predisposition towards free will or agency, as opposed to a predisposition for thinking about things in terms of fate and structure, right? Like these are not mutually exclusive possibilities. You could say the same thing with utilitarianism versus deontology, right? Where we're talking about the principle of the matter versus the outcome. Well, guess what? A whole human being, and almost all human beings throughout the history of humanity who are not philosophers in this sort of academic sense, they don't make these mountains out of molehills. They don't make them mutually exclusive. They live in the contradiction, and they are able to walk and chew bubblegum at the same time, so to speak. Most people are able to be like, principle matters and outcome. I have to think about this. Philosophers come along and sort of help you set up this extreme, no, it's this or it's that, right? And of course, like any great philosopher is able to really build up this huge system that makes the one way look like it's the only sensible way. And then, of course, they get their little acolytes, and then people are reacting to them. Oh, it's Kant versus John Stuart Mill. No, it's not. There's other ethical approaches. We'll do a whole episode on the ethical approaches. I don't want to get into that right now. What I want to focus in on here is that I'm talking about the way that this Befindlichkeit being equiprimordial to Wisterian, modal possibilities, that being gerrymandered means, no, it's one way and it's mutually exclusive to the other way. And it matters in philosophy just as much as music. That when I'm talking about the level the gerrymandering of Befindlichkeit gets in this age of the medium, and this place we find ourselves thrown into 100 years after the institution of progressive, universal, coerced, age-segregated schooling, this hyper niche kind of take towards identity, where people say, oh, I like all music, but of course they would never listen to what we listen to. First of all, there's that. But then there's also people who are just like, I hate country, or people who are like, oh, I just hate screamo. Like people have like these very strong positions that come from very specific points in their attempt to find this competitive defensive identity within the context of probably middle school. Right? It probably has something to do with their parents. It probably has something to do with their peers. It probably has something to do with attraction and feeling repelled by certain things. And of course, like you end up becoming habituated to a certain approach. And Befindlichkeit, when I say gerrymandering Befindlichkeit, it's just a shorthand for saying gerrymandering Wisterian Befindlichkeit Rede. Like I'm not gonna fucking say that, right? But when you say Befindlichkeit, that's a metonym for all three that are equiprimordial. You could say, and maybe I should be saying, gerrymandering disclosedness, right? Since disclosedness kind of speaks to all three. But I've tended to focus on Befindlichkeit because when I'm thinking about your predisposition towards a progressive way of cherry picking from reality and interpreting it and going for an ideology that works with that versus a way that's really just looking back and is just like, no, man, this historical period, that was it, man. That was peak humanity. That predisposition is a mode of attunement, as is utilitarianism versus deontology. These are fundamentally about attunement, but so is your predisposition towards the prioritization of a genre. And so people have a much easier time seeing this with genres. People have a much easier time saying, I fucking hate rap, or I fucking hate country, or I like all music. Okay, yeah, but liking all music is also like not being super passionate about any one kind of music. Right? The person who says that they like all music never really gets going with people who are super passionate about a specific kind of music. And so all of these are about your kind of attunement. We were talking about Bill Murray before we started the recording, and this is going somewhere because I've been thinking a lot about genre bending and
like
why
five threads you put out there I want to pull on too.
Why I love genre bending, and we can kind of go into this a bit more.
Genre bending, yes.
Think about all these people who've been kind of coming into country music. You've got Beyonce, you've got Post Malone, you've got Ronnie Radke with Falling in Reverse and doing it with Jelly Roll, right? You've got, and then of course, Johnny Frank, former vocalist of Attack Attack, one of the heaviest bands from the metalcore scene, and now he's doing a sort of country pop experimental. No, it's wrong to call it country pop. It's wrong to call it country metal. It's wrong to call it, because he's constantly moving through genres. And what I'm getting at is that there's a way of being experimental that tries to be unintelligible to everybody. And of course, you know, I could think of, like, I don't know, The Fall of Troy, or even more, you know, The Sound of Animals Fighting. Like, these are bands from back in the day that are super.
I've wrestled the bear once. Super experimental,
as opposed to, no, I'm talking to everybody. I'm just moving through everybody's moods. I am expressing myself as a human, but I'm going to weave my way through everybody's moods. So here you'll hear me get a little heavy. Here you'll get me hear me a little country nostalgic. I'll get a little, I mean, it's almost like NSYNC sometimes with Johnny Frank. It's just like, but the way that he is moving through these, I think Ronnie Radke does it as well. I think Post Malone obviously does it. And it's, you know, obviously there's a lot of money in country right now, and I think that the people are realizing, hey, I can actually like kind of cash in on this. There's obviously like this sort of political economic reason, but also it's a big fuck you, and I know it was for Ronnie especially. It's a big fuck you to the scene that almost at the level of its identity made this like decisive, we're anti-country, right? That's Ronnie said that wearing a cowboy hat. He was like, oh yeah, well, fuck the scene, man. I could give a shit less about the scene. I'm so sick and tired of these scene kids and how they want you to stay within this one thing. Well, something that brings us together is wanting to be able to do something similar at the level of philosophy, theory, practice, when we're talking about organizing with people. There's a way to organize with people where you're not just surrounding yourself with history buffs or philosophy people who want to play the gadfly and then name drop references that you're supposed to read before you can have a real conversation. There's a way to break out of these super, super niche spheres. And obviously the springboard into this was talking about the difference between metalcore and black metal. And I know that's where your story is currently on pause. Like you're that's where you're at. But I'm saying, like, it's perfect because this sort of narcissism of small differences within the world of genres and how they splinter or fragment in the post-class fractured mass. This is exactly what brings us together as organizers. How do we organize in a way that can almost like weave people the way that Johnny Frank is able to move through genres?
Mm-hmm. And this is where, so notes for later, we need to do a Dewey, Bourdieu, Heidegger kind of human nature style talk with the predispositions. Those would be impulses from Dewey, habits from Dewey, habitus. Field would be more like the environment. There's so much of how they all overlap. It can add so much to each other. I want to do one really quick jump back to the scapegoat I was making of the kind of liberal enslaved to instrumental reason technocrat of like part of it is that they by their that's not practical in immediately shutting everything down kind of attitude, what they're doing is thinking they are taking stock of the world we are being in while not engaging with it at all, and that kind of becomes their method, but it's a method of retreat. That's something I'd also like to talk about later. But the music thing, the whole time you were talking, it gave me a clear direction of where to go. This is why, for me, music wasn't working as that avenue. Because what happened was I would meet these people in a cultural sphere where my interests were slightly less dominant. I'm not sure it would have been different anywhere else, but nonetheless, I was jamming with these people where someone had to make a sacrifice, and I would be the person that would do it happily. I was never complaining, but I just wasn't having fun. I was just kind of desperately reaching out for people to play music with, but I wasn't having any fucking fun doing it, so it felt like a waste of time. And there was that competitive sphere in that place, subtly, so subconsciously, where I made the sacrifice. Okay, I'm not going to be the one playing anything that I want to play. I'm just here for the good time, which is why I then made that shift. Like, it can't be music for me, at least. In the same way, maybe Dave was talking about, for him, it can't be a philosophy club. So I kind of did an opposite thing where I was like, no, I'm going to make a philosophy club. And what was the difference there is that in music, it was much harder to imagine that there couldn't have been some kind of non-sacrificial lamb in that atmosphere. I was not able, I was not predisposed. Well, no, I was not trained to do any of the kinds of genres they were doing. I didn't necessarily enjoy them. To make that kind of change and try and do some kind of crossover would also require them meeting halfway, meeting me halfway, of making some kind of sacrifice. Okay, I'll do a little more metalcore and you learn a little bit more Metallica style metal or something. But it wasn't really the space for it. Whereas in this philosophy club that I've started, and to call it that is so weird. It came to this place where I was like, okay, it needs to have an adaptable level of formality and informality. I'm trying also not to go too much into the how aspect of this, because a lot of this will be saved later. But that
Sure.
process of getting here was, I need community, I need more IRL activity, I need more touching grass in the spirit of communion with others. And so I was like, okay, let's pull on all of the random connections I've made so far. I reached out to, I'm married to a Finn who has family in the area. So I reached out to like in-laws or whatever, and all of her friends from her past, my friends from random adventures throughout my time here, because I'm still a very cheery social person. And so I'm just organically making friends everywhere anyway. I reached out to my old philosophy students from that folk school course that I'd hosted. I made posts on public Bookface, the popular social networking site, pages for like the local community, either in English or in the Finnish sphere. And in doing that, I just got all these bites. There were 30 plus people that had reached out in the span of a few days. And all of a sudden, I just threw them into a group chat where I had already on WhatsApp. I gathered all their information, said, that's how we're going to do it. I said, no talking in here. This is just for logistics. I will tell you where, when, and materials or whatever. And it was just about getting people there first. And that first one being so crucial of, to quote one of my favorite TV shows, Letterkenny, sorry, it would be Shoresy, the spinoff of Letterkenny. It's like, set the tone. So I set the tone, boys. I went out there, coach, and I just set the tone. And it was that we're here. This is a space. We're congregating around maybe this concept that half of you don't know called philosophy. The ages were ranging from somewhere between, I would say 19 is our youngest, and in our late 50s is our oldest. We had a surprisingly weirdly equal share of men and women. We also had a surprisingly equal share of immigrants and Finns. I expected it to be just all immigrants, really. But that has kind of maintained, which is really nice. And most importantly, a type of enough of a diversity. The way I sold it, the way I reached out, was to leave space for enough of a kind of intellectual or predisposition style diversity to come in. Not like race, sexual orientation, gender
Yeah.
identity kind of diversity. Not that that's unimportant or whatever. It's just not relevant here. It's not interesting. The idea is like, okay, here's a Russian immigrant who's Eastern Orthodox with 2 children that are almost as old as me, that's joined. And here's someone from Sudan who's a computer scientist and has a very mathematical view of the world. And here's a PhD in physics who's really interested in Foucault for some reason. And then here's like an English literature expert or whatever. And then here's like 5 or 6 people who have never stepped foot into a university. And just have random ideas. Here's our kind of new age. They've listened to some Deepak Chopra and therefore they think they know philosophy. For one meeting, we had a guy who came who embodied that kind of super fucking cringe kind of corporate culture or whatever. And that's my one regret. I wish I could have found a way to get him to stick around, but this is one person who clearly didn't feel welcome. And I don't think it was my doing, but that was very sad. I would have loved to have that person. stick around. But it was through that it allowed, like, we're not here to learn about philosophy or discuss philosophy. That's just our kind of foundation. That's our excuse. That's a great way to put it. That's our excuse to convene in a space of minds, regardless of our previous experiences or levels of expertise or weird arbitrary hierarchical ascribings that we give to one another. And it has developed that way, so much so that there have been times where we don't talk philosophy at all, and no one is disappointed, and people continue to come back. And now we're evolving into that stage where it comes into what else can we do? Can I organize a public gathering where we just go down to, here in Finland, the infrastructure for like kind of free outdoor activities is phenomenal. It's truly unmatched on planet Earth, I would say.
For real.
So we have all these like grillikotta, like a grill house pavilion or lean-to or something in the beautiful trails on these lakes in the forest, and they're stocked for free with free firewood, and they have little outhouses and everything. And you go there, you can bring your own food and just grill it on the fire. All you need is a match and some paper to help start
Can
the fire.
verify.
And it's incredible. And so getting all them together, our last one was been a bit busy, so our last one was in May. So it was still a bit cold, and still 20 people fucking came, and they brought, most importantly, some of them brought their children. We had 3 children, all under the age of 5. There were multiple pets as well. There were people totally disconnected, because of course I'm reaching out to like my sister-in-law, for example, like, hey, come and join this. And of course she did. My partner came too. And it was like a way of combining those worlds, of shaping a space in which we could realize that we're all human beyond these hyper-reductive niche tendencies as well. Whereas if I had stayed in that music sphere, which for me just happened to be one that wasn't working, I couldn't imagine really going to a grill with some of them. And then in the meantime, the maintenance work would be, for every 20 hours we did of painful jamming for me together, we get 1 hour of like more public, who are you as a person kind of space. This one, it really pays off that way. And so yeah, there's just all this, there's all this necessity to think about, construct an environment in which I'd really like to nail down the fact that it's about, for lack of a better word, like the intellectual diversity. That's what's important. And it is only through that it is able to transcend any of, for example, when Dave shares his experiences with things like philosophy clubs, it devolves into an argumentative debate style format where people platform themselves and their own ideas. It's hyper politicized in ways that are exclusive, et cetera, et cetera. I think in this case, I was just extremely lucky, but also with some foresight and some planning, that by the very nature of the way it's set up, it is to avoid that.
Yeah. If it's getting annoying, you need to step back and try something else for a while, right? And so for me, hate to interrupt, but we would be remiss to not share an advertisement from our sponsors. And we're not sponsored by any corporate or state entities other than ourselves. So I'll just tell you a little bit about some of the past courses and the ongoing courses here at TU. Because if any of them sound exciting to you, well, you can access all of them by becoming a subscriber. That's right. Subscribers make all of this possible. Subscribers get access to the course I taught on Martin Heidegger's Being and Time, as well as the course that I taught the first half of last year, Emmanuel Levinas's Totality and Infinity, the second half for which I will be teaching this winter. I've also taught Critical Media Theory and Critical Doxology and Timenergy with my wife, Anne Snellgrove McKerracher, who is the co-host on What's Right. Also, you would get access to the course I taught at the university, 3 semesters worth, on Intro to Critical Social Theory and Socioanalysis. But also, we've had lots of other great professors teach Introduction to Marxism by Chris Catrone, Intro to Lacan via Seminar 11 with Todd McGowan, Introduction to Ivan Illich with Brian Weeks, The Clinical Structures of Psychoanalysis and Autism with Dr. Leon Brenner, the Michael Downs Seminar, Introduction to Slavoj Žižek, Introduction to Nick Land, and Žižek's For They Know Not What They Do, all taught by Michael Downs, as well as What is Sex? That was a collab that I did with Cadell Last. Theory 101, a collab I did with Hello Gorgias. And then also, of course, there's Carl Jaspers' The Idea of the University, PMC Consciousness and Ideology. These were early, very important courses that I taught with friends at TU back in 2023, and they remain important to this day. Every one of these courses comes out of an overarching research project. There's a real driving force, mission, and agenda to the research going on at TU because we want to understand the situation for the sake of large-scale structural change focused on the good life. What does that actually mean? If you really want to go deep, obviously, these courses are something you could spend the better part of a year binging while at work. Ongoing courses that come out on a monthly basis are the Fundamental Problems and Core Concepts at TU with yours truly, also my seminar, Philosophy of Nature with Nina Power, the Benjamin Studebaker seminar, as well as his course, The 12 Political Theorists. We've got some really exciting stuff coming down the line. The only way to make this all possible and really deepen your knowledge and familiarity with all of these different things is to become a subscriber today at http://theoryunderground.com/subscribe. Thank you. If it's getting annoying, you need to step back and try something else for a while, right? And so for me,
Exactly.
I was getting annoyed. But here's the other thing. Like, I kind of just don't care about other people and their opinions at this point. I'm really over it. Like, opinions is just what I'm not shopping for. And I don't even want to share my own opinions. I mean, that's an opinion. There you go. But it's just like, I found myself having to practice patience. I'm like having to be patient with people. And then it's like, well, yeah, because they're coming for something that I'm kind of offering. That's my own fault for offering the thing. I just don't, I'm looking for something that it's like, okay, well, the same thing is true with like a book discussion group, right? Well, oh, we've read the book. Now we're going to talk about it. And then we're going to do another book. We're going to talk about it. And it's just like, there's something about the way I was setting these things up that was resulting in certain things that I was finding like annoying. And it's like, well, there was still lots of really good stuff too. Like, don't get me wrong. And I've met amazing people doing it. A lot of times though, these things, you try them out for a while and then you might just realize you need to step back, try something else. And then when you do it again, it won't be the same. Right. And so when I say I don't want to do a philosophy club or a book discussion, this is a Hegelian negation. This is a Freudian. I'd prefer to say a Freudian negation. Cause when I'm saying it's not a philosophy club, it's like, well, I'm not saying it's not a stamp collecting club. If I said it was not a stamp collecting club, you'd be like, well, what? Why would you have to stipulate that? The reason I have to stipulate that it's not a philosophy club or a book discussion is because those have particular meanings, not just for me, but also I think in the American culture. And so, how do you do something that's kind of like that, but not that, right? And so like, I'm inspired by hearing you talk about what you're doing. I think that's really good. Something like that. And so what I did with Early Risers was I created a group on Meetup. Is it .com, .org, whatever, Meetup. And I paid for the organizer version of it so that I could create events. People would see the events. People could come. And I packaged it a few different ways, but the reason it was called Early Risers was I wanted to speak to and attract a kind of person who is sort of over the sort of philosophy discussions that happen where people need some beer in their hand. And I figured a roundabout way of doing that without it becoming on its face, obviously, about that, right? Like a sort of ulterior way of getting a more sober and serious kind of turnout was to do it at an ungodly early hour, right? And so I was doing 6 a.m. I think it was because I think we found out that the breakfast cafe I like to go to in Boise called Capri, it opens at 6:30. So, it became a 6:30 meetup. And because of that, I only got like 6 people, like 30 people joined the group on Meetup, but then I only ever had max 6 people. but those were better conversations as a result, so emphasizing the fact that it's like you are hungry for new ideas and a more serious kind of conversation, and you're really trying to make sense of life and where you're at and what you're doing, and so much so that you feel motivated to be there early in the morning. Well, guess what? That means that the other kind of people that you're finding in this space are also going to be like that. So it really kind of sorts out the people who are serious. And the other benefit to doing it that early is that almost nobody actually has anything going on during that time. So there's no conflict. On a Saturday evening, there's conflicts. On a Saturday, 6 a.m., there's no conflicts. The only conflict would be your sleep. And if you're excited to go once a month to something at 6 a.m., I'm excited to meet you. Like, that was my idea. I was like, I'm excited to meet you if you're excited to meet me at that time. Like, that itself is like this filter factor that makes it interesting. Like, I met this guy, he never came back. He just came one time. And his whole thing is just near-death experiences. He's been reading all the books he can get his hands on to think about near-death experiences. Well, guess what? Even if he didn't come back, that's a really interesting guy. And obviously he's thinking deeply about this kind of stuff to come at 6 a.m. He's not just like having a beer with the boys and being like, well, I've been reading some books about this. It's like, it's a lot more like there's stakes. There's stakes in it. Now, I'm not saying that that's going to be what I do here. I'm not going to do a replica. I've got all kinds of ideas for, something where it's like there's 3 to 5 different ways of getting involved. And I advertise all 3 to 5 to different sort of demographics. Like, one would be a hiking thing. Like, we're going to go on a hike. And every time we do this hike, we'll say something that happened that week, something that we keep thinking about, a book that we want to be reading right now, and then where we're going. Like something we're doing next week, or, I don't know, something. And we go on a hike and we all just kind of share like a very basic thing. And it's always this, and we just do that once a month. And then people find out when they do that, oh, I also do this other thing. Right. And that would be one point of entry. Maybe another one would be like a film discussion group. And that would be a point of entry, except that at this point, I'm not so sure about film as the point in. It might be wrong. A wrong sort of emphasis for me, because I kind of don't. I've tried to do it so many times, but I just kind of I want to take a break from movies for a while, so it's probably just not the right time. But stuff like that, and so you can see how a book discussion group could factor in. But like, what would these different points of entry lead to? What would the meetup sort of like the thing look like? And it's like, my ideal. My ideal would be that there would be an opportunity for me to go deeper into the text that I love and talk about the ideas that I'm working through and stuff like that. But that's not the whole thing. And that I'm not just attracting people who are looking for that, but that's also there. And so, in terms of thinking about my own most possibilities, I'm also thinking about, well, we're here on a farm. We have organically grown. It's not technically organic because the certification's a nightmare, but it's no-till, absolutely zero chemical, local, delicious, amazing food. And we're all about building soil but also teaching. My mom already had teaching in the description, and it's like, for her, that's more like teaching how to develop your green thumb abilities. And it's like, yeah, well, I also have all kinds of lectures in me about localism and its relation to universalism. These do not need to be mutually exclusive, right? But localism really matters, especially for people who tend to think about things in universal, large-scale structural terms. It's like, no, the local really matters, though, because anybody who's thinking a lot about large-scale structural change without having a deep sort of appreciation for local plurality, which comes down to particularity, which usually is separated from universality. It's whatever they cook up is not going to be satisfactory for most people, right? So it's like we have to live between these worlds, and so I'm thinking about, well, what are kind of like sort of intellectual kinds of things that I could do here on the farm. So these are ideas that I'm thinking about here, and that I want to be able to develop. And I think next time we're going to go into some of the more practical stuff. You've already given some very practical stuff here. Just, your point about setting the tone is such a big deal. Yeah.
And your addition of a kind of barrier to entry that it is, of course, contingent on the thing you're setting up and people you're trying to either weed out or attract. I think that's incredibly important. But yes, I think I have, because of course, coming into this being our first meeting, this is no knock on you whatsoever, but it was very vague and abstract for me as to what this would be about, what exactly we'd be doing. And I think that was maybe on purpose, or even if it wasn't, at least kind of subconsciously. But the thing that was very clear to me from the start was we're going to talk about the how of doing this kind of organizing. So I swear that I've got much more coherent, organized, and a much longer laundry list of thoughts on those kinds of things too. I do love this format. I love that there is space for meandering, but with a kind of purpose. I don't think we were ever off topic. But I do think we have to, overall, there's kinds of two things that I'm left with at the end of this, the kind of why, right? So if we're asking like, why do this? Well, because we live in a world of pseudo-activity and the spectacle, we have to be asking the questions. If our goal is to transcend this, which I am saying at least one of my most important ones is, I don't know if it's possible, but it's still my goal. Right. Can we? That's a big question. How do we do it? That will be for next time. What are we missing? Where is there potential left in the world already? What infrastructure, institutions, et cetera, can I use? Where was it before? And where is it no longer? I think that allows for a kind of historical thing. And then like what potentials have yet to be inquired and then acted upon into existence. That being the first one. The second one is like, beyond just the goal of transcending this, there needs to be a specific goal as to what we're aiming for in our kind of organizing. So if I want something like a book club that is more intellectually stimulating, it's totally fair to say that my goal is slightly more of an intellectual stimulating kind of group or experience. My goal with this philosophy club, for example, although it might seem that's an obvious interest, was not that. And I was very clear from the start. My goal is, hey, I'm feeling a little lonely. I want to meet a bunch of people and I want to hoodwink them into coming to this thing where I can grab them with the thing. The most sexy any person can be is by being passionate about something. And there's nothing I'm more passionate about than shit like this. So I was like, cool, I'll just attract some friends. And of course, most likely, most of the people who show up are going to be in a similar mindset. We even named it, actually put it out there like, yeah, I'm just kind of here too, because it's a cool way to meet people. What a great filter, a great barrier to entry. I'm likely to meet interesting people. And so like it's connection for me over the kind of old school, kind of radical liberal days of Bauer in the late aughts, early tens, where it was like political activism, protest, kind of all praxis with very, very little theory, if any, just kind of doing change. How do I make the world a better place? Sure, that's important. But no, the goal is like connection for me. That was my goal with this. And so, yes, all these questions, but those two kinds of things, if our goal is to transcend the world of the imprisonment of living in a pseudo-activity spectacle conundrum, we cannot escape this monster, this fucking Cthulhu that's taking over. No Nick Land reference intended. I'm just using the word in its original sense.
Too late.
And then also like, what is my goal in that organizing? What is it I want to? What's the space I want to provide, etc. And my goal in particular for this is connection. It is, and particularly with as much intellectual diversity as possible, which is a measure by which I measure myself against. Like, am I doing well or doing poorly? If all of a sudden I only had people that agreed with every single thing that I said, and I changed every religious person to my non-religious views or vice versa, there's a problem.
So you don't want to start a cult?
No, I think it's funny. I feel like I almost go out of my way. I think this is very much a manipulative tactic, but with good cause in mind. I almost go out of my way to bolster anyone's expressed like ideas in the group that I know someone else in the group disagrees with, even though everyone's amicable. There's never any proper real argument. But like, for example, if the Eastern Orthodox person brings up something that's like hyper religious and why we should believe in God or whatever, I go like, oh, that's a really interesting point that actually feeds into this thing. And then all of a sudden that person sees like, the subject's supposed to know. I'm like the teacher figure in this space or whatever. I'm like authoritatively declaring like that has value. That's valid. And they're like, oh shit, maybe I should listen to things who have. But of course, the sad thing is we live in a world where it has to be me that validates that in order for that person to take it seriously. But anyway.
This is a killer tie-in though to, Surutu Phase 2, and I was thinking about calling this podcast that we are doing. Well, really, so I haven't said this yet, but if this is sort of episode 1, Bauer is in a rotation of co-hosts, and Ruiz is another one, and there's a couple others in the lineup, and there's different projects, right? Like there are things I'm excited to kind of go over and do with you, whereas there's things I'm more excited to do with, like Ruiz. We're going to be doing Neil Postman, just a whole bunch of Neil Postman related stuff, because he's been at TU the one member who's been most like going back to Postman, like constantly going, and I'm always like benefiting from everything he says about it. And then I'm just like, oh, dude, I have the itch to get back to Postman too. Well, then I'm doing it with him, but it's not, there are several criteria that, that factor into, who I invite to come on this podcast. Right. And so there's a lot of this behind the scenes at TU where, gold and platinum members do this with me. It's just not public. Right. But to end up on the public side, there's a few criteria. One is just like, I think it would be interesting for other people. I always find it beneficial if I do it with somebody, but at the point that I'm like, no, I think that the audience will benefit from something about this, then I might want to make it public so that, that's also there. But also I know you in real life, and you're doing IRL organizing, and we have fun doing this kind of stuff. And I want to do more of this kind of stuff. And I also want to be doing more Bourdieu, and you're thinking about Bourdieu, but also your Dewey and my Heidegger factor into Bourdieu. And so we bring something really special there. So, thinking about the performativity of speech, when he's using Austin well, that's all in classification struggles. We'll get into it. But that is something that is going to be really fun to bring into dialogue with your pragmatism, my phenomenology, right? So there's all these different criteria. There's others as well. But one of the things that I was thinking about is like naming the podcast, because I do Why Left with Benjamin Studebaker and What's Right with Anne. And I had a couple other podcasts that I was trying to start this year that I decided to not pursue because of complications. And then it's like, well, those were a great idea, but then there's been a lot of other ideas since then, right? And one of the ideas for naming this would have been something in the why, who, what sort of vein, so it's like kind of stays on brand. He stays in the sort of obvious sort of lineage of these other podcasts. Maybe, there's a couple of ideas that I'm not going to bring up here or now. But then, what one sort of working thing was just Surutu, because Surutu is about socioanalysis and alien anthropology, and a kind of approach that goes beyond theory and practice dichotomies, and is a direct response to the post-class fractured mass and staying virtual and instead getting into meet spaces. So Surutu's already, checking those boxes. So why even come up with a different name? Socioanalysis and Alien Anthropology Research Unit at TU. That's a great acronym, right? Well, maybe we'll call it that. But also, I was thinking about, if theory underground is this sort of thing out of which has grown these podcasts. Well, one outgrowth might be praxis on the ground. You got theory underground and praxis on the ground just for fun. We're talking about praxis. Every one of the co-hosts I bring on here is going to be someone who's actively organizing locally, thinking about what's working, what's not working. And so we'll be having these exegetical conversations based on texts, sometimes a lecture here and there, but also always having this sort of meta touching grass conversation like that. That's exciting for me. So even if we don't call it Praxis on the Ground, we give ourselves a month or two to come up with the right name. Even if we don't call it that, everyone will know that we thought about calling it that, because that is one of the big themes here.
I immediately jumped to why act, because I was thinking then you could also bring in like what the existentialist side of it. Not that you or I are huge into existentialism, but also sometimes like we need a little optimism bump, a little, line to snort of some happiness. And I'm thinking like taking the Camus route of like, why not take your own life? Why act? Why live?
Yeah.
Why be? Why exist at all? Everything. Let's anti-black pill, but with the recognition that we're not just feeding a bunch of people like some tacky airport self-help bullshit of like, no, everything's fine, but yes,
I
Praxis
like
on the Ground.
I like why act. Why act,
I
Praxis on the Ground.
I love the on the ground. I want to find something for the Praxis. I want to. Is there some kind of wordplay where it can be like maybe thrown on the ground, where it's like an action,
Yeah.
or imagine like that brings in Heidegger.
What, projecting on the ground? Yeah, because like
There
the
we
other,
go. Yeah.
like reprojection is a term I've been using in some of my writing recently, as well as for the 3R retreat at the end of September here on the farm. We're talking about it being an opportunity to recollect, reground, and reproject. And so the R3 or R squared retreat. I really like reprojection because it kind of goes along with retroversion or retroaction, like the idea of like, well, we're always already acting, we're always already projecting possibilities, but we're also able to reproject in certain ways, and which is also to say we can requilt the projects we've done, and in doing in taking on a more deliberate interpretive responsibility for what we're doing, hopefully better harness and counter certain tendencies in nature, in culture, whatever. So I like Steven said, he said throw it on the ground. Oh, threw
Like
it on the
the
ground.
Lonely
He's like,
Island song,
yeah, that's what he's,
it ain't my birthday or whatever, but I threw it on the ground. Yeah.
yeah.
I don't need no handouts with the hot dog, free hot dog, so I threw it on. That's good shit. I'm
Yeah.
really, really spinning. I think we have to do something with ground. You're right. And I'm thinking, okay, it's underground. Could it be overground, as if like an exact opposite, and then
I did
something
think about
overground,
that.
praxis
Yeah.
overground. But on the ground also makes me think of like gonzo journalism, like you're out there in the world.
Right.
That's
Right.
really cool. Um, uh,
Boots
shit.
on the ground.
Are we
Boots on the
are
ground.
we like free balling right now? Is this like boots on the ground? Oh, I mean, why
Yeah.
not?
Yeah.
Yeah. We're countervailing the hegemonic world order of the US boots on the ground. There we go.
Yeah. Yeah. Boots on the, hey, whatever. I've just,
Yeah,
it's a
I
free
know, I know.
space of throw whatever on the wall, and
Yes.
we'll retroactively see what sticks. But
Mm.
really quick here, let me do this. All right. And so I had paused for a moment so we could touch base about the direction we're going in here.
Wait, you had paused earlier before this exact moment, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh,
No,
okay.
we're
Because
we're
right when you said
unpaused right
paused,
now.
I like pretend
Yeah.
flashed the
Yeah.
camera. Not
No.
that it matters. I don't have boobs, but that
Yeah.
was my
Yeah.
stupid fucking dad joke. I always gets me.
Good. Good. Um, so Ruiz is actually here, a virtual fly on the wall, and I'm gonna invite you now, man, to turn on your camera whenever you want. All right, here we
I'm gonna
go.
go let the dogs in, but I'm listening mic on too.
All right, hold on. Actually, let's see. Let me do this. There we go. What's up, David? How you doing, man?
Good, good. How are you guys doing? All
Doing
right.
just fine. Doing
Never
just
had it so
great.
good.
Yeah.
Here to bring the sunny disposition.
Does Bauer think we're paused? No, he can listen though. He can hear us. So let's just go. He's
Okay.
just managing dogs, which we've both been doing throughout this podcast, which is very important. We talked about nature, nurture, and natality, but we don't talk enough about how dogs are a really big part of that. You know, nurturing nature and natality. You know, dogs teach us how to do this in a sort of way. I've been learning a
Where my
lot.
dog's at.
Where my dogs at? So what you thinking, David?
Just a quick thing about the title of the podcast. Not that this is an actual recommendation for it, but I was thinking, why me? You know, why me with all these interesting people that you
Yeah.
talk to? But anyway, apart from that, it's like I love the discussion here toward the end about kind of like the conversation of theory and action, because that's definitely something that, as someone who's kind of new to this kind of world, um, I think about a lot, because I'm like, is this just kind of like learning for learning's sake? Is it, what am I going to do with this stuff? So I love that this conversation is happening, and the fact that you two have so much experience with this question. Seems like it's something you guys have been wrestling with for a long time. So as me, as like kind of like the ultimate slipstreamer, kind of like obviously never at the front, but always kind of like, taking taking this whole experience in. It's awesome just to hear how you guys are talking about all these experiments that you've already gone through. And I'm so new to this world that you're the one that actually told me that I do organizing. I was like, I organize? And then, yeah, you mentioned the whole thing about, how I take part with the live apparatus, which was trying to organize, I guess, like a virtual space for bands to kind of perform at while they didn't have any venues during the whole pandemic situation and stuff. And hopefully we'll get into some more things with that same group that they have kind of in the works. So that's pretty cool. So I'm excited about that. But again, I didn't even know that was organizing. I just thought I was taking part of it, some cool band stuff. But yeah, it was a great discussion. I loved it. It was like seeing kind of like where you guys were at, as far as how you were saying how when you guys were in college doing like the coming to grips with like the idea of, is this pseudo activity, and kind of seeing like the things that from the outside looking in, it does look like organizing. Like I wouldn't have distinguished you guys from what the priest was doing, except maybe in the sense that I would have had like that intuitive gut feeling of like what the priest was doing was a little more kind of superficial in a way of, let's just take the pictures and move on. um but yeah, very interesting stuff. And there was something in particular that Bauer had said that piqued my interest. And unfortunately, I was kind of multitasking, so I couldn't pay too close attention. But there was something that like I stopped what I was doing. I was like, oh, that was good. About how for some people the practicality of things kind of becomes like the way to shut conversations down. Like, oh, that's not practical. So like it's almost like you feel like offering up these ideas, and then someone's just like, oh, that's not practical. And it's like, oh, they must have thought about it already. But in a lot of cases, no, they haven't. It's kind of just like, it's the opposite. It's like, I haven't thought about it and I don't want to think about it. And you should probably shut up and let's get back to work.
Yeah.
So
It's the ultimate retreat. It's like the total thought terminating cliche. It absolutely
yeah,
ends all possibility for any discourse. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And it's crazy because it's almost like when you're new to thinking about things, I guess, I mean, if that's even something to say, but I think you guys know what I'm getting at. It's like,
Yeah.
shit, they must have thought about it. And I'm just like the little newbie here trying to offer up something. And yeah, maybe I'm out of, I'm out of line here. Let me get back to the practical thing that, isn't working, but, you know, it's just the thing that I've been assigned, or whatever it is, whatever the example could be. Um, but yeah, that's kind of really all I had. I'm really looking forward to diving into some Neil Postman and stuff. It's definitely been, um, I'm very new to theory, as I've mentioned before. It's most of the things I've looked into have been like doing a deep dive into Postman. Um, I think it was 2009, or maybe a little before. It was like right around the time that they did Amusing Ourselves to Death, that anniversary edition that they did. And then I kind of just went away from it because I went into the corporate world and I had to just focus on like just surviving basically. But then kind of, I forget why that came back around, but the point is that it did. And then I just did like this huge deep dive that it was like, oh man, Neil Postman's more than just amusing ourselves to death. He's got, you know, Technopoly, and he's got the education thing. So,
Well, yeah,
um,
you didn't get involved with TU for the stuff we were doing on Postman, but you know, it was your stuff with, you know, your organizing virtual IRL hybrid events in the music scene that
yeah.
got you interested in TU, and then
Mhm.
you know, through Žižek or whatever was already on your radar, right? If I remember correct. But then at some point you're like,
Yeah.
oh, they're using Postman, and you're
Yeah.
like, oh, there's a bunch here, and then it was, I think, a coalescence of you and Daniel Garner both being like, oh, Postman does all this stuff on education, and me being like, what? Oh,
Yeah.
snap. And now I'm like, I will take Postman over everyone else when it comes to the education stuff. I love him. Dude, teaching to what is it? It's not transgress. Is a subverse, teaching as a subversive activity,
Subversive.
and then
Yes.
teaching as a conserving activity. He's like taking these sort of this sort of progressive radical, and then also this sort of conservative radical, like energy to teaching. So he has a book dedicated to
Yeah.
each of these concepts or modes of approach, and a ton of other stuff. We'll get into it. I want to bring it back real quick though, just to practical life, and say that what I love about this triangle that we've drawn here between Dewey, Heidegger, and Bourdieu is that all three of them are, in a sort of way, arguing against the academic version of the Western philosophical canon and saying practical life is first. And so all three of them do this. So it's actually a way, each one of them becomes a way of taking the person who says, I care about practical stuff, and saying, ah, yes, so do I. All three of them become a way of being like, sure. And that's deep, actually. We can go much deeper into that. Right? In fact, would you like to hear me talk for 12 hours a critique of people who are not practical? Right? I can do that with you. I'll be using something that seems a little theoretical, but all three of them are getting at that.
Yeah, make them put their money where their mouth is, you know, hold them accountable for their kind of hand waving attitudes,
Yeah.
which doesn't happen enough. And I think the best part is that I think they are, it's less kind of intended to be aggressive or debating too, so they can kind of get away with it in terms of just like the regular social sphere. It's not like saying, you're stupid, I'm better than you, or like, I disagree, you're a racist or whatever, you know, those kinds of call out things. It's a very like kind of bless your heart type of condescension, but they are not even maybe aware of it as such. And so they get away with it on like 50 different levels. That's not practical. Yes, I'm really happy. Is it Ruiz? Do you want us to like totally anglicize it? I'm seeing Ruiz with my kind of hyper Spanish language learning background, but you can tell me.
Oh yeah, no. It's whichever you prefer.
Okay.
Yeah, if you want to
Okay.
practice the Ruiz, by all means. But yeah, Ruiz is
Ruiz.
fine
Okay.
too. Yeah. Whichever you like. It's really not
But I'm really happy that David convinced you that what you were doing was organizing, even though it was, for lack of a better word, like kind of apolitical. My whole thought on that is like everything on this entire fucking planet is already politicized, whether we like it or not. I think that's a reality we have to confront. And so it's like, well, then why not count all that stuff? It is politicized, but yes, to do that space, I think that's more commending. We ought to get away from just saying that organizing is in the space of pure kind of Democrat Republicans against each other canvassing or whatever. Yeah. So that's cool. I'm glad that Dave is spreading that commendations amongst our fellow travelers and stuff. So
definitely. Yeah.
I was just excited that somebody was looking into TU initially, like, oh, they're doing stuff different organizationally and being more like oh, it's a bonus that there's theory involved, you know, whereas it's like, oh, there's a bonus that I'm learning something, but primarily like what's going on here organizationally. I like that because it's like, that to me is one of the underrepresented, underhyped, you know, parts of the whole thing, right? To me, it's a constant experiment in organizing. Yeah. And it doesn't ever
Yeah,
go
that's
the way I
awesome.
plan, which is why I've kind of gotten away from. I don't like planning anymore. It's just like I do, but I just don't like talking about it because it's just like you spend so long explaining why you've come up with what you've come up with, and by the time that you're done explaining it, it's already changed. And it's just like you could get into a sort of infinite regress of explaining, and it's like maybe I'll talk about it when I'm 50. All right, we can have that conversation then. We'll do a little bit here, along the way, but also it's just not practical. And so I wanted to say,
Yeah.
bringing it back to that, when people hear readiness to hand versus present at hand or presence at hand, Heidegger is getting to this distinction between knowledge that can be put on paper in language, which is to say the knowledge of representation or of representations, that, representations make things present, right? So we're talking about that which is being made present at hand. Well, it's inferior for a million reasons that he shows, in a sort of sense, to readiness to hand, which is our first encounter with everything. It's always this sort of like we're navigating the world in this sort of practical way first, right? And so Hubert Dreyfus is sort of the father of teaching being in time on the internet, over at UC Berkeley. And he was very appreciative of pragmatism. And so he would always bring it back to Dewey talks about handiness. This is related. They are, in a sort of sense, getting at the fact that we have a useful kind of knowing relation to things prior to their rationalization and representations. So that's going to be...
And of course, Rorty did it better. Rorty, in my opinion, is the much more Heideggerian, Dewey and Heidegger.
Yes.
Without, in the ways, I think Dreyfus loses both some Dewey and Heidegger along the way. At least your Heidegger and my Dewey, we would agree that way about Dreyfus. But I think Rorty does a much better job of maintaining, which is so funny. I never thought that I would, once I entered properly outside of our real life friendship space and did my first public foray into TU, that I would be like the pragmatist. It's so much not really my dense philosophical identity. I'm much more, I guess, like deeply continental. Granted, pragmatism is my through line through all my philosophical experience and kind of expertise, maybe I would say. But I'd much rather talk about like Baudrillard or Hegel or any real kind of post-Marxist or even the deeply philosophical aspects that go beyond just politics and things like that. So I'm happy that this is giving me a kind of excuse to re-enter. Like, no, when it comes to like, maybe there's more utility, for using a kind of dirty word, in Rorty and Dewey than I thought. I used to only do them if I imagine myself in like an academic philosophical conference setting. That's where I'm going to turn on my Rorty and my Dewey. And we're going to go into kind of dissecting dense perennial philosophical questions that don't really have any bearing on our everyday lives, the kind of smart performance, if you will. But this is really kind of forcing me to revisit those and see if I can extract some of my philosophical expertise into a casual conversation. Yeah.
Bourdieu's going to give us both ample opportunity to draw on these traditional through lines that we have, our bases in the more academic stuff, but also he sees this as a martial art, and he sees it as a martial art because it's a sort of combat sport to find yourself in a space with people who think they know everything or think that they know the limits of what we can know based on their traditions in the academy. And it's specifically this critique from practical reason in a sort of sense that gives us a basis for doing a sort of hand-to-hand combat. Not one that even necessarily comes to blows or arguments, because there's a way of setting up your mode and discourse in a way that that precludes even having to go there. Right. There is and I think Bourdieu's, especially, if we'll get this all throughout his seminar, he's always about the setup. And it's a kind of setup that sort of sets him up to be like Neo dodging bullets, right? He gets to do something that most other intellectuals can't get away with. And it's because he has this method preempting. And so it is like the martial art that is mostly just like, oh, I'll just kind of step aside and let you go here, and I'll just kind of like give you a little push, and then you'll roll yourself into a ball. I don't even have to submit you, you know? So it's magical, you know, what he's going to do. And it's important because we are trying to bridge these worlds, the life of the mind and the work of the hands.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So
I'm just excited mostly to get beyond the like PMC progressive symbolic violence is the only thing we ought to learn about Bourdieu, and we'll reappropriate in this way. I mean, that's the thing is I've read Bourdieu, I've engaged with Bourdieu, I've been taught Bourdieu, but it was all back in my undergrad during one of those degrees was a social work degree, and it was all focused on that kind of maybe pop sociology aspect. Granted, some of it felt a bit complex, but it was still always that kind of language of like, let's not explore what we mean by violence or by symbolic. Let's talk about think of it like microaggressions. That's kind of how it was taught in a sense. Yes, which maybe back then I was much more susceptible to. Not that I'm fully unsympathetic to that context. You know, everything is, you know, has a baby in its bathwater. But just the degree it's been.
It's the HR the human resource, the HR, the focus grouped HRification of the John Stuart Mill's harm principle, radicalized through Rawls for bureaucrats, and then taken up
and you
by
know, the
students.
Best part is that's not practical. That's not practical is symbolic violence of the most intense degree to all three of us here right now, and we would never get recognition for it. You know what I mean? It totally disallows us and our ideas to exist in a space where they're just totally foreclosed upon. They're not allowed to happen. Yeah. They're lucky I'm not weaponizing it that way.
Based. All right, guys. I'm gonna close this out now. I'm gonna close this out. I'm excited to come back to this with you guys next week and the week after. For everybody else, thank you.
Nice to meet you, Ruiz. Definitely. Look forward to
same here.
more casual experiences in the future too.
Nice to finally have you on here, Bauer. And good to see you again.
I have to say, I know I'm just fucking glazing you, as the kids would say, or whatever, but like, I really appreciate this. I've been waiting for my one-shot opportunity chance to blow. It only comes once in a lifetime. You better.
Yeah. You didn't.
Is this your first time completely?
Yeah.
Yeah, my first time publicly, like, so Dave and I have just been like proper friends for what, like 13 years, 14 years-ish now. And there's always been this, sorry, Dave, I'm keeping you a little bit longer, but I need to fill at least one other person on the kind of hot goss behind the screen or veil or whatever. I am a philosopher. I'm really engaged with philosophy. I make it my whole life. I take it very passionately. I'm extreme. Political philosophy is definitely my bent. That's another thing where this is kind of interesting too, because it's slightly less political. So Dave and I have always had that like kinship and connection, of course, but we've always just been friends. So there's this awkward, maybe fabricated, maybe real, it doesn't really matter, but this imagined kind of gap I couldn't traverse when I was like, dude, I fucking love what you're doing. How can I like do it? Is it going to be weird? You know, it's kind of like they say you shouldn't have a business with your friends or your family, or that you shouldn't get a roommate that is your best friend, or you'll dislike each other. You know, and so there's always that fear in the back of my mind too. And also, like, how awkward is it? Like, hey, dude, do you bring me in as a friend too, or do you bring me in as like a person who actually does exist in the sphere and has something to say? What's the balance there? How much can we expect of one another?
Something that complicates it for you as well is that you were following it all the way back in the theory plebe days, and that in those days it was more expressly influencer verse. And so, you know, part of the underground vibe for me is like, yeah, it is supposed to just be like a lot more like, no, like I do this with friends. It's not like a professional influencer verse side of things. It's not, you know, it's in the attention economy. there is we are not just talking, we are also in talking, performing, talking, and there is the representation that we're making within the spectacle as a contribution. It's dialectically or cybernetically in relation to the attention economy is present. It's in the room with us, and it's weird, but the underground thing is to break that. That's why I've done 3 world tours at this point, like, or not world tours, but 3 tours
I
so
think we
far.
should also acknowledge you literally invented Theory Underground on the couch just downstairs here where I live in this tiny town of
that's right.
Sotoma in the middle of the forest of eastern Finland.
That's cool.
That's where I was like there, and you were vacationing as a
For
friend,
2
and Anne,
weeks.
who's also my friend.
For
like a long time to come and
Yeah.
like hang out and chill. And the side project is while I was doing some working and living here and there, he was on the couch or in the little kind of guest house type cabin thing, like making the website and coming up with the logo, and which was at the time the underground symbol for the London Underground, the subway system, which was I won't take, well, I can take credit for it now because now it's no longer the symbol, but that was my idea proposed down there, and we were just kind of shooting the shit. And even at that point, from the very beginning, I found it hard to be like, hey, can I help? Can I be involved? How do I insert myself into your project that you're putting all this effort into? And that was just totally the wrong time in my mind. But it's cool. I see Theory Underground lives as it was birthed in the downstairs of this house I love so much, and that's one more thing I love about it. So.
Dude, yeah, no, you provided the unstructured space. You structured the unstructured space within which I was able to obsessively focus and work on it as much as I was. And from there, we had to move to Mexico for 6 months just to save money enough and to then also have more of that kind of space. I needed that extended. And the only way to do that was to go to Mexico. But I don't think we would have really known that's what I needed as confidently as we did by the time we moved to Mexico, had it not been for you providing that kind of space. And that is, this is, we'll come back to this in terms of like buildings, like material buildings matter. And, the brick and mortar really matters. And, the thought that goes into a brick and mortar also is very important. And so, I'm currently in the process of building a studio, and my little promo about the studio will be shown on this episode. And so, or it already has, depending on where I placed it. But that little promo about the studio shows like an overview, like I'm flying it over with the drone, and it shows the excavator clearing the ground. And, as people follow this over the next few months, you're going to see the actual thing come out of the ground. Basically, it's like the studio will come up. But the studio, which is the sort of objectification and sort of putting down roots for the agora, sort of thing that you'll see that kind of become this real thing. It's going to be a very technological studio. It's going to have a lot of tech in it. I instantly and simultaneously want the writer's cabin that I want to call the Hermitage. You know what I mean? It's going to have a typewriter. It's going to have a kerosene lantern. It's going to have a cot. It'll be a place where people can go for solitude, and it'll be a place for writing books, right? Like sort of technology.
You do know I want to offer our guest house as that. That's been I think even when you were here, I was explaining that. Yeah. Like, and I want to make sure that whether we continue in this way or not, I really hope we do, of course, but I want to at least stay connected to you in terms of course, there'd be like a barrier to entry of the people I would kind of allow to do it or sorts. But like, let's say Benjamin Studebaker, there's an obvious candidate, like wanted 3 months where you could come stay kind of scot-free and write a book in our little guest house. It'd have to be the summer or else it'd be hard to live there. It's very cold here. But I want to offer it that space. It's got to be a real project. Doesn't have to just be philosophy. It can be art, any kind of creative stuff too. But I'll pick and choose who I allow. But they'll get that. So remind me, and I'll remind you many times into the future. Maybe we can have a trial run in place for next summer or something, where like someone comes and we offer that space for someone to dissertate, if that can be verbed. That's
like a sort of post-grad, work spot, like where you'd be free to work on the thing that you need to that you
And
need
of course,
to
it
do.
doesn't
Yeah.
have to be someone in the academic field too, like
Right.
let's say we have a friend who's in our circle who has, a book they want to write, and I know them well enough to know, like, oh shit, that's something I definitely like to provide some support to or whatever. I've got to work out some kinks, of course, too. I mean, I do have a partner and that's involved. I know she's also at least mildly invested in the idea, but working out like how does it work? What do we provide them? We're out in the middle of nowhere, so they kind of need transportation. Do we charge like a very like barrier to entry? Do we say like $100 a month? That's what you pay, for example, or we'll take you grocery shopping with us once a week. That's kind of setting a boundary or something. Here are the things you can use in our bikes, our boats, or whatever, and here are the things that all that kind of stuff. It's got to be worked out, but there goes me overthinking everything again before it even happens. But I just have such a
Pretty
dream of
cool.
that because I think especially you, I think much more than me, but me to some degree, and even Ruiz, I can already guess this, have enough connections in our lives of people that we think would not just be worthwhile of giving that space to, but could really feed into our overall vision that we all
Mm,
share by having that space.
mm.
And yeah, it's cool.
Sounds
Not
amazing.
everyone can offer something like that, and not everyone has the financial means to really devote a couple months or whatever of their life to the time energy.
But for the people who can, I hope that it becomes a more real possibility for them, like a more serious, like,
Yes.
oh, that's a real value, because it really is. It really is. Yeah.
Yeah.
Tremendous value, yeah. Especially
So
I'm thinking
start
of it
working
as
on your
someone
book
from a big
ideas, and we
city,
can have
so.
you out someday. Oh, sorry, I was talking to you, by the way, Ruiz. Yeah.
All right, I better get cracking on that then. Yeah, but yeah, no, as someone from a big city, I mean, the fact of somewhere like isolated like that, that sounds interesting for sure. Like, and it definitely has like a little bit of like a motivating factor. Like, shit, if I could come up with a project, that would be kind of cool. So it's definitely
Mm.
inspirational for sure.
All right, guys, I'm gonna close
And
it
if
out
any
now.
of us could follow in
Nope.
the steps of your theory underground, yes, yeah.
All
What's next from our couch? That's what I'm asking.
All right.
Okay,
Peace.
yes, I'll just talk all day, but very nice to
Yeah,
meet you, Ruiz.
same,
Appreciate it.
same. Looking forward to the next time.
Subscribers get access to all past courses at Theory Underground, as well as ongoing courses taught by David McKerracher, Benjamin Studebaker, and Nina Power. Subscribers also get access to monthly research seminars, and the higher tiers of involvement unlock discussions and one-on-one small group tutelage. So if you're like me and you're never a huge bookish kind of person, but somewhere along the way you got really into listening to educational materials, if you got really into listening to podcasts and then books at work, if you love going deep into ideas, but you're just not a traditional bookish kind of person, well, this is where the alliance between people like us and people who are more bookish and specialized are able to meet to work through these things and do so in defense of the human, in defense of our dignity, in defense of our common humanity and our intellectual integrity. This is not a place where we're going to kick you out because you're pro-life or pro-choice, or where you are an atheist or a agnostic or a Christian. But it is a place where you're expected to love one another regardless of such things, and to show up for people in your actual IRL real life communities regardless of such things. And if that is exciting for you, and if you're excited to learn about what this approach, this method, this school of thought has to offer, then I'm excited to meet you. Subscribe today.